Overconfidence in their own reasoning. Overconfidence in one's own reasoning is one of the most quietly dangerous traits an intelligent person can have. It doesn't announce itself as arrogance. Instead, it disguises itself as certainty, clarity, and mental discipline. When someone has spent years being rewarded for thinking well, solving problems, and seeing patterns others miss, their mind begins to trust itself implicitly. This trust feels earned, it feels safe, and that is precisely why it becomes exploitable. The danger lies in the assumption that good reasoning automatically protects against bad influence. Intelligent people often believe that if something is wrong, they will notice. If someone is dishonest, they will detect it. If an argument is flawed, they will dismantle it. This belief lowers their defenses before any manipulation even begins. They stop watching the person and focus only on the logic being presented, unaware that manipulation rarely attacks logic directly. It wraps itself around it. Manipulators exploit this by presenting ideas that appear internally consistent, intellectually flattering, or complex enough to invite analysis rather than suspicion. The intelligent mind steps forward eagerly, engaging, dissecting, refining, believing it is in control. Meanwhile, emotional framing, selective information, and hidden incentives slip past unnoticed because the mind is busy proving how capable it is. Overconfidence also creates resistance to correction. When doubt appears, it is often dismissed as overthinking or temporary confusion. The person assumes the problem must lie elsewhere because their reasoning has always worked before. This creates a dangerous loop where intelligence becomes a shield against humility and certainty becomes a blindfold, allowing influence to take root quietly while the mind congratulates itself for being vigilant. Belief that intelligence equals immunity. The belief that intelligence equals immunity is one of the most seductive illusions the mind can hold. It forms slowly, reinforced by years of being right, being competent, being the one others turn to for answers. Over time, intelligence stops feeling like a tool and starts feeling like armor. The idea settles in quietly. Manipulation works on other people, not on me. I see too much. I think too clearly. I understand how influence works. This belief is emotionally comforting, and that comfort is exactly what makes it dangerous. When someone feels immune, they stop scanning for threats. Their skepticism becomes selective. They no longer ask whether they are being influenced, only whether the argument makes sense on the surface. Manipulation thrives in this gap because it does not need to overpower intelligence. It only needs to bypass self-doubt. Influence works best when the target believes they are above it. The intelligent mind often assumes awareness cancels vulnerability, not realizing that knowing about manipulation is not the same as resisting it in real time. Emotions still fire first. Trust still forms before logic arrives. Identity still seeks validation. Manipulators understand this and lean into it, framing ideas as rational, nuanced, or intellectually respectable, knowing the listener will lower their guard to avoid seeming irrational or paranoid. The belief in immunity also creates shame around being wrong. If intelligence is supposed to protect you, then being influenced feels like a personal failure. This causes people to rationalize manipulation after it happens rather than confront it. They defend the influence to protect their self-image, not realizing that intelligence does not remove human wiring. It only makes the trap more sophisticated and far harder to see once you are already inside it. Tendency to underestimate emotional influence. The tendency to underestimate emotional influence is one of the most common blind spots in highly intelligent people. It stems from a deep identification with logic, reason, and conscious thought. When someone prides themselves on thinking clearly, emotions begin to feel secondary, even intrusive, something to be managed rather than something that drives decisions. This creates the illusion that feelings are optional and that influence only works through arguments and evidence. In reality, emotions always move first. Long before logic assembles its case, The nervous system has already decided what feels safe, exciting, threatening, or familiar. Intelligent people often miss this because they notice the reasoning that follows, not the emotion that led it there. They believe they are choosing ideas when in fact they are responding to emotional cues that have already shaped the outcome. Manipulators exploit this by never attacking logic directly. Instead, they create emotional states: urgency, belonging, fear of exclusion, admiration, moral superiority that quietly steer thinking. Once the emotion is in place, logic is recruited to justify it. The intelligent mind becomes an accomplice, constructing elegant explanations for choices that were emotionally primed from the start. This blind spot is reinforced by pride. Admitting emotional influence feels like admitting weakness, so discomfort is reframed as insight, attachment as rational alignment, and excitement as clarity. Over time, this creates a dangerous gap between what someone believes is happening and what is actually driving them. The most unsettling part is that emotional influence feels invisible from the inside. It does not announce itself as manipulation. It feels like insight, like intuition, like finally seeing the truth. And because the intelligent mind trusts its conclusions, it rarely looks back far enough to notice the emotional hand that quietly guided it there. High trust in logical consistency. High trust in logical consistency is a powerful strength that quietly becomes a vulnerability when misplaced. Intelligent people are trained, rewarded, and praised for recognizing patterns, coherence, and internal order. When something makes sense step by step, the mind relaxes. Consistency feels like safety. It signals that effort has been applied, that care has been taken, that truth is present. This reaction is automatic and deeply ingrained. The danger is that logical consistency can be manufactured. A narrative does not need to be true to be coherent. Manipulators understand that if each step follows cleanly from the last, most people will stop questioning the foundation. The intelligent mind focuses on whether the reasoning holds together, not whether the starting assumptions were chosen selectively or designed to mislead. Once consistency is detected, skepticism drops. Contradictions are explained away as nuance. Missing information is assumed to be irrelevant rather than intentionally omitted. The mind fills in gaps generously, trusting that a system that feels logical must also be honest. This is where influence slips in unnoticed, because logic becomes a substitute for verification. Emotional comfort plays a role here as well. Consistent systems reduce cognitive strain. They offer relief from chaos and uncertainty. Intelligent people, who often carry the burden of constant analysis, are especially drawn to explanations that feel complete and elegant. That relief creates attachment, and attachment creates defense. Over time, this trust in coherence can override lived experience. If reality feels messy but the logic feels clean, the logic wins. The person begins defending the structure rather than questioning it, unaware that manipulation rarely looks like confusion. It looks like clarity, it looks like order, and it feels convincing precisely because it aligns so well with the mind's desire for things to make sense. Assuming others are rational. Assuming others are rational is a quiet projection that leaves intelligent people exposed. It comes from living inside a mind that values consistency, evidence, and internal logic, and then unconsciously extending those standards to everyone else. When you reason carefully, it feels natural to expect the same from others. You listen for arguments, weigh explanations, and respond as if truth is the shared objective. The problem is that many people are not optimizing for truth at all. They are optimizing for power, validation, control, comfort, or advantage. When an intelligent person assumes rational intent, they misread behavior. They search for logical explanations where none exist, and in doing so, they excuse actions that should raise alarms. Manipulation thrives in this gap between expectation and reality. When someone lies, misleads, or acts in bad faith, the rational assumption delays recognition. The intelligent mind gives them time. It considers alternative interpretations. It assumes misunderstanding instead of strategy. Each moment of generosity becomes another opportunity for influence to deepen. Manipulators rely on this. They know that appearing reasonable buys trust, even if their goals are not. They exploit the fact that rational people argue ideas, not motives. While the intelligent mind is busy refining points and clarifying misunderstandings, the manipulator is shaping outcomes. Emotionally, this assumption is comforting. Believing others are rational preserves a sense of order in the world. Letting go of it means confronting the reality that some interactions are not conversations, but maneuvers. That realization is deeply unsettling, so it is resisted. The mind clings to logic as a shared language, unaware that it may be the only one speaking it. In that imbalance, influence takes hold quietly, not through superior arguments, but through the false safety of misplaced trust. Desire to appear reasonable. The desire to appear reasonable is a powerful social instinct that quietly shapes behavior long before a person realizes it is happening. Intelligent people often build their identity around being fair-minded, rational, and balanced. They want to be seen as someone who listens, considers all sides, and does not jump to conclusions. This self-image feels virtuous, mature, and intellectually honest. It is also highly exploitable. Manipulation thrives where social pressure meets self-image. When someone wants to appear reasonable, they hesitate to challenge things that feel off but are presented calmly. They delay saying no. They soften objections. They tolerate discomfort longer than they should because pushing back risks looking emotional, biased, or extreme. The fear is not of being wrong, but of being seen as unreasonable. Skilled influencers take advantage of this by framing harmful or self-serving ideas in measured, polite, and seemingly fair language. They speak calmly, acknowledge counterpoints, and position themselves as balanced thinkers. This creates a trap where disagreement feels socially inappropriate rather than intellectually necessary. The intelligent person starts negotiating with their own boundaries to preserve their image. Over time, reasonableness becomes a leash. Red flags are reframed as misunderstandings. Pressure is reinterpreted as dialogue. Manipulation is mistaken for discussion. The person stays engaged not because they feel safe, but because disengaging feels rude or intellectually lazy. What makes this especially dangerous is how invisible it feels from the inside. The person believes they are being thoughtful and open-minded, unaware that their need to appear reasonable is overriding their instinct to protect themselves. By the time clarity arrives, commitment has already formed, and walking away now feels unreasonable too. Aversion to appearing paranoid. Aversion to appearing paranoid is a quiet social pressure that shapes how intelligent people protect themselves. Intelligence is often associated with calm reasoning, emotional control, and measured judgment. Because of this, suspicion can feel embarrassing, as if questioning motives signals insecurity or a lack of sophistication. The desire to be seen as rational discourages open distrust, even when something feels off. This aversion creates an internal conflict. On one side, there is a subtle sense that something doesn't quite add up. On the other, there is the fear of overreacting, of misjudging, of being the person who sees threats everywhere. To resolve this tension, the mind often sides with social safety. It explains away discomfort, reframes warning signs as misunderstandings, and waits for clearer proof that rarely arrives. Manipulators rely on this hesitation. They know that most people, especially those who value intellect and composure, would rather doubt themselves than risk appearing paranoid. This gives manipulation time to deepen. Boundaries are delayed, questions are softened, red flags are rationalized as complexity or nuance. The emotional hook is subtle shame. The idea that suspicion equals weakness keeps people silent, even internally. They tell themselves that a truly intelligent person wouldn't jump to conclusions, wouldn't assume bad faith, wouldn't disrupt harmony without certainty. Meanwhile, manipulation thrives in ambiguity, not certainty. By the time the threat becomes undeniable, the cost of acknowledging it feels higher than the cost of ignoring it. Trust has already been extended, narratives have already been accepted, and the person realizes too late that protecting their image as reasonable mattered more than protecting themselves. Intellectual arrogance. Intellectual arrogance rarely feels like arrogance from the inside. It feels like confidence earned through effort, discipline, and repeated proof of competence. It grows quietly as a person becomes accustomed to being right, to seeing what others miss, to correcting flawed thinking in rooms where few can keep up. Over time, this confidence hardens into an assumption. My understanding is deeper, my judgment sharper, my perspective more reliable. That assumption changes how information is processed. Ideas that align with one's self-image as a capable thinker are welcomed and expanded. Ideas that challenge it are dismissed more quickly than they should be, not because they are wrong, but because accepting them would require acknowledging a blind spot. Manipulation thrives here because it does not need to overpower the intellect. It only needs to flatter it. Manipulators feed intellectual arrogance by positioning themselves as equals or admirers. They present arguments that appear sophisticated, contrarian, or above average. Knowing this activates the desire to belong to a smaller, smarter group. Once that identity is engaged, resistance weakens. Disagreement begins to feel like ignorance. Skepticism feels unnecessary when the source appears intellectually worthy. Arrogance also creates isolation. The more someone believes they see clearly, the less they listen. External warnings are interpreted as misunderstandings. Emotional reactions from others are treated as noise rather than signals. This narrows perception and increases dependence on one's own internal logic, even when that logic is being subtly guided. The most dangerous part is that intellectual arrogance masks vulnerability as superiority. The person believes they are immune because they are sharp, unaware that the very certainty they trust makes them predictable. Influence does not target stupidity. It targets confidence that refuses to question itself, and once that confidence is engaged, it will defend almost anything rather than admit it was led astray. Excessive self-criticism. Excessive self-criticism is one of the most exploitable traits in intelligent people because it masquerades as humility and self-awareness. Highly intelligent individuals are often acutely aware of their flaws, limitations, and past mistakes. They replay conversations, reanalyze decisions, and question whether they could have thought better, acted better, or known more. This habit feels responsible, even virtuous, but it quietly shifts the balance of trust inward in the wrong direction. When something feels off in an interaction, the self-critical mind looks inward first. Instead of questioning the other person's intent, it questions its own perception. Discomfort becomes doubt about judgment. Confusion becomes evidence of personal failure to understand. Manipulators rely on this reflex. They do not need to convince you they are right. They only need you to believe you might be wrong. This internal interrogation creates hesitation. Red flags are softened into misunderstandings. Boundaries are delayed in the name of fairness. Each time the intelligent person gives the benefit of the doubt, they weaken their own instincts while strengthening the manipulator's position. Emotionally, excessive self-criticism creates a hunger for validation. When someone offers reassurance, clarity, or confidence, it feels grounding. Manipulators provide this selectively, alternating doubt with approval to deepen dependence. The intelligent person mistakes relief for truth. Over time, self-criticism becomes a control mechanism. The person polices themselves more harshly than anyone else ever could. By the time they consider the possibility of manipulation, They are already invested in defending the situation because admitting exploitation would mean admitting their judgment failed, and that feels more painful than staying confused. Overthinking, simple deceptions. Overthinking simple deceptions is a trap that intelligent minds fall into almost instinctively. When something feels off, the mind doesn't immediately suspect dishonesty. Instead, it begins searching for complexity. It assumes there must be layers, nuance, or a sophisticated explanation beneath the surface. Intelligence is trained to look for depth, so simplicity often feels insufficient even when it is accurate. Manipulators rely on this tendency. Simple lies survive because they are too plain to be taken seriously, while the intelligent person is busy constructing elaborate theories, weighing multiple possibilities, and questioning their own judgment. The truth sits quietly in front of them, unexamined. The deception doesn't need to be clever, it only needs to be boring enough to escape scrutiny. Overthinking also creates self-doubt. The more angles the mind explores, the less confident it becomes in its initial perception. What started as a clear gut reaction becomes diluted by endless rationalization. The person tells themselves they are being cautious, thoughtful, and fair, when in reality they are talking themselves out of obvious conclusions. Emotionally, this creates a sense of control. Analysis feels safer than confrontation. Thinking feels more dignified than accusing. So the mind chooses complexity over clarity, not realizing that deception often depends on hesitation, not belief. The delay is the opening. The most effective lies exploit the intelligent person's respect for nuance. By assuming that anything important must be complicated, they miss the uncomfortable reality that some manipulations are crude, repetitive, and emotionally driven. The mind stays busy while the truth remains simple, and in that gap, influence settles in quietly, protected by the very intelligence meant to expose it. Susceptibility to flattery of intellect. Susceptibility to flattery of intellect is one of the most precise entry points into an intelligent person's inner world. Praise aimed at the mind feels different from ordinary compliments. It doesn't just feel good, it feels earned. When someone validates intelligence, insight, or depth of understanding, it touches identity, not ego. It confirms the story a person tells themselves about who they are and why they matter. This kind of flattery is powerful because it lowers defenses without triggering suspicion. Compliments about intelligence feel objective, almost factual. Being told you see things most people miss or you think on a different level creates a subtle bond. The listener feels recognized, singled out, understood. Trust begins forming before any request or influence appears. Manipulators use this deliberately. By positioning themselves as someone who appreciates the target's intelligence, they create alignment. Disagreement then feels like betraying that shared understanding. The intelligent person becomes more open, more patient, more willing to engage, because walking away would mean walking away from someone who finally gets them. Once flattery is established, influence follows quietly. Suggestions feel collaborative rather than directive. Ideas feel co-created rather than imposed. The target begins defending the interaction, not because it is safe, but because it affirms their self-image. Doubt feels like insecurity. Resistance feels like arrogance. The most dangerous part is that intellectual flattery often disguises itself as respect. It feels ethical, clean, even mutual, but when validation becomes conditional, it turns into leverage. The person starts protecting the source of affirmation, unconsciously prioritizing approval over caution, unaware that their intelligence has become the very thing being used to guide them. Identity tied to being smart. When intelligence becomes an identity rather than a trait, it quietly reshapes how a person protects themselves. Being smart stops being something you do and becomes something you must defend. It is no longer just about thinking well, but about preserving a self-image that feels central to worth safety, and belonging. This makes influence far more dangerous because threats to ideas start to feel like threats to the self. When someone's identity is tied to being smart, being wrong is not just inconvenient, it is destabilizing. Doubt feels humiliating. Changing one's mind feels like losing status. Manipulation exploits this by framing beliefs as reflections of intelligence itself. The idea is no longer simply correct or incorrect. It becomes sophisticated, nuanced, or what intelligent people see. Once this happens, questioning the idea risks questioning one's own identity. This creates powerful emotional pressure to stay aligned. Evidence that contradicts the belief is reinterpreted, minimized, or attacked, not because it lacks merit, but because accepting it would fracture the self-image. The mind shifts from seeking truth to maintaining coherence between belief and identity, often without conscious awareness. Manipulators reinforce this by offering validation. They subtly signal recognition, respect, or intellectual kinship, making agreement feel like belonging. Disagreement begins to feel like exile. The smarter the person believes they are, the harder it becomes to step outside that role without fear of loss. The tragedy is that intelligence thrives on flexibility, yet identity demands rigidity. When being smart becomes who you are, curiosity shrinks, humility fades, and influence finds an opening. The person believes they are thinking freely, but in reality, they are protecting a version of themselves, and that version can be guided, flattered, and trapped far more easily than raw intellect ever could. Fear of being wrong publicly. Fear of being wrong publicly grips intelligent people at the level of identity, not ego. When someone is known for being insightful, competent, or intellectually sharp, their reputation becomes part of who they are. Being wrong in private is uncomfortable, but being wrong in front of others feels like a collapse of credibility. This fear quietly shapes behavior long before it is ever acknowledged. In conversations, this fear makes people defend positions longer than they should. Instead of stepping back when something feels off, the intelligent mind doubles down, refining arguments, adding nuance, and searching for ways to appear consistent. Manipulators sense this hesitation instantly. They create situations where backing out would look like inconsistency, ignorance, or weakness, knowing that social pressure can override internal doubt. Public settings amplify this vulnerability. Once a stance is taken, changing it feels costly. The intelligent person worries about losing respect, appearing naive, or undermining their authority. This fear keeps them engaged in conversations that should have ended, aligned with ideas they no longer fully believe, or committed to narratives that no longer sit right. Emotionally, the fear is paralyzing. It turns disagreement into a threat and correction into humiliation. Manipulators exploit this by framing challenges as tests of intelligence rather than opportunities for truth. They bait debates, escalate complexity, and trap people in performances instead of reflections. The most dangerous part is that this fear silences instincts. The moment something feels wrong, the mind suppresses it to maintain composure. What could have been a quiet exit becomes a public stance. Influence deepens, not because the argument was stronger, but because retreat felt more painful than staying. Reliance on abstract thinking over instincts. Reliance on abstract thinking over instincts is a habit that forms when intelligence is consistently rewarded and intuition is quietly dismissed. Intelligent people learn to trust models, frameworks, probabilities, and explanations more than immediate felt reactions. Instincts are seen as crude, emotional, or unreliable, while abstraction feels clean, elevated, and controlled. Over time, this creates a distance from the body's warning system. Instincts operate faster than conscious thought. They register tone, timing, inconsistencies, and subtle threat cues long before the mind can articulate them. But when someone is trained to value abstraction, These signals are overridden almost automatically. The discomfort is analyzed instead of respected. The unease is reframed as bias. The internal alarm is treated as noise rather than information. Manipulation thrives in this gap. While the instinct senses danger, the abstract mind asks for proof. It demands explanations, data, and justification before allowing itself to act. By the time evidence appears, emotional hooks have already formed. Trust has already been extended. Boundaries have already softened. Abstract thinking also creates emotional distance. It allows people to discuss harm, intent, and consequences as concepts rather than experiences. This makes it easier for manipulators to stay engaged because the interaction feels intellectual rather than personal. The intelligent person remains present in the conversation while slowly disconnecting from their own internal signals. What makes this especially dangerous is that abstraction feels like maturity. Ignoring instincts feels like rising above emotion. In reality, it is often the suppression of crucial survival information. The body notices what the mind explains away, and when instincts are consistently overridden, manipulation no longer needs to hide. It only needs to sound intelligent enough to keep the mind occupied while the warning signs are silently dismissed. Difficulty recognizing bad faith. Difficulty recognizing bad faith is one of the most costly vulnerabilities intelligent people face because it arises from a belief in reason itself. Those who value logic, discussion, and understanding often assume that others are operating under the same rules. They expect disagreements to be honest, arguments to be sincere, and conversations to be driven by a shared search for truth. This assumption feels ethical, even noble, and abandoning it feels like cynicism. The problem is that bad faith does not announce itself. It mimics intelligence. It borrows the language of reason while quietly abandoning its principles. Manipulators argue not to understand, but to exhaust. They question not to learn, but to delay. They concede small points not as honesty, but as strategy. To an intelligent person, this still looks like engagement, so they keep responding, explaining, clarifying, believing progress is being made. This is where the trap tightens. The intelligent mind focuses on strengthening arguments, unaware that the other person is not bound by truth or consistency. Time, energy, and emotional investment are drained while the manipulator gains leverage simply by staying in the conversation. Recognizing bad faith requires abandoning the comfort of fairness. It means accepting that not everyone wants clarity and that some people use dialogue as a weapon rather than a bridge. This is deeply uncomfortable for those who define themselves by reason because it forces a painful realization. Intelligence alone cannot protect you if the other side is not playing the same game. And until that realization settles, manipulation continues under the disguise of debate, slowly eroding boundaries while appearing completely rational. Assuming complexity implies truth. Assuming complexity implies truth is a subtle bias that quietly grips intelligent minds. When someone has spent years engaging with layered ideas, abstract systems, and intricate theories, complexity begins to feel like a signal of depth and effort. Simple explanations start to feel suspicious, even naive, while dense language and multi-step reasoning feel earned. The mind associates difficulty with legitimacy, and that association becomes a shortcut. Manipulation exploits this by adding layers that don't need to be there. Extra variables, elaborate frameworks, and sophisticated terminology create the impression of rigor, even when the core idea is weak or distorted. The intelligent mind engages eagerly, dissecting the structure instead of questioning why the structure exists at all. Attention shifts from truth to interpretation. Complexity also creates fatigue. The more mentally demanding something is, the more likely a person is to trust it simply to stop evaluating it. Once enough effort has been invested, walking away feels wasteful. The mind begins defending the system because it has already paid the cognitive price to understand it. This is where false ideas gain protection, not through strength, but through exhaustion. Emotionally, complexity flatters. It signals that the material is not meant for everyone, that understanding it requires a certain level of intelligence. This activates identity and pride, making the person feel chosen rather than cautious. Doubt starts to feel like incompetence, not discernment. The most dangerous part is that complexity can hide gaps effortlessly. Contradictions are buried under nuance. Missing evidence is masked by abstraction. The explanation feels complete even when it explains nothing. The intelligent person walks away feeling enlightened, unaware that clarity has been replaced by confusion dressed as sophistication, and that truth rarely needs to be difficult to survive scrutiny. Preference for elegant explanations. Preference for elegant explanations is a subtle craving that runs deep in intelligent minds. There is a unique emotional satisfaction in simplicity that feels profound, in theories that compress complexity into clean, graceful narratives. Elegant explanations create a sense of mastery. They make the world feel understandable, ordered, and less overwhelming. For someone who spends their life navigating complexity, this clarity feels like relief. That relief is precisely where manipulation enters. Elegant explanations are not necessarily accurate, they are efficient. They strip away messiness, contradictions, and inconvenient details in favor of coherence. Manipulators exploit this by offering narratives that feel intellectually beautiful, even if they are built on selective truths. The intelligent mind, drawn to structure and symmetry, focuses on how well the explanation fits together rather than on what has been left out. Once an elegant framework is accepted, new information is filtered through it. Evidence that supports the explanation feels validating. Evidence that challenges it feels like noise. The person begins defending the elegance of the idea rather than questioning its relationship to reality. This creates emotional attachment, not to truth, but to the feeling of understanding. There is also identity at play. Being able to explain something simply is seen as a mark of intelligence. Letting go of a clean narrative can feel like admitting confusion or regression. Manipulators understand this and present their ideas as insights only a thoughtful person would appreciate, turning doubt into a threat to self-image. Over time, the preference for elegance becomes a shortcut that bypasses caution. The mind confuses aesthetic satisfaction with accuracy. What feels right becomes what is right. And because the explanation is so neat, so compelling, so easy to repeat, it spreads internally without resistance, quietly shaping beliefs before skepticism has a chance to intervene. Ignoring power dynamics. Ignoring power dynamics is a mistake that often comes from believing that ideas exist in a vacuum. Intelligent people are trained to focus on arguments, evidence, and reasoning, not on who holds leverage, authority, or control. They assume that if a discussion is logical, it is fair, and if intentions sound reasonable, the playing field must be equal. This belief feels principled, even noble, and that is why it is so easily exploited. Power does not need to announce itself to shape outcomes. It operates through dependency, status, access, and consequence. When these forces are ignored, manipulation becomes invisible. An intelligent person may engage in a discussion believing it is mutual exploration, while the other party is quietly setting terms, defining limits, or holding consequences that have not been named. Manipulators often frame unequal situations as collaborative or intellectual to disarm suspicion. They invite debate, encourage openness, and present themselves as peers, knowing that the intelligent person will focus on the quality of ideas rather than the imbalance of risk. The moment one side has more to lose, the conversation is no longer neutral, no matter how polite it sounds. Emotionally, ignoring power dynamics creates confusion. Discomfort is misread as internal doubt rather than external pressure. Compliance feels like agreement. Silence feels like consent. The intelligent mind tries to resolve the tension with better reasoning, unaware that no amount of logic can compensate for unequal leverage. What makes this especially dangerous is that power often hides behind civility. There may be no threats, no raised voices, no obvious coercion, just consequences that only activate once it is too late. By the time the imbalance becomes clear, the person is already entangled, wondering how a conversation that felt reasonable slowly turned into a position they can no longer safely leave. Confusing confidence with competence. Confusing confidence with competence is a subtle error that intelligent people make precisely because they are used to reading patterns quickly. Confidence presents itself as clarity, certainty, and decisiveness, all traits commonly associated with skill and intelligence. When someone speaks smoothly, asserts ideas without hesitation, and appears untroubled by doubt, the mind instinctively assigns them authority. It feels efficient to trust certainty, especially in complex or unfamiliar situations. The emotional pull of confidence is strong. It reduces ambiguity and relieves the mental strain of constant evaluation. For intelligent people who often live in a state of analysis, confident figures offer a kind of psychological rest. Their assurance feels like direction. Their tone feels like evidence. This creates a shortcut where delivery replaces verification. Manipulators understand this dynamic well. They invest heavily in sounding certain, not in being correct. They speak in absolutes, dismiss alternatives quickly, and frame disagreement as confusion rather than difference. The intelligent listener, sensing composure and decisiveness, may unconsciously defer, assuming that such confidence must be backed by understanding. The danger grows when confidence aligns with partial truths. Even flawed ideas can feel solid when delivered with conviction. The intelligent mind, rather than slowing down to test assumptions, begins adjusting its own thinking to match the apparent authority in the room. Over time, this confusion erodes independent judgment. Deference replaces scrutiny. Certainty becomes persuasive on its own. By the time inconsistencies emerge, trust has already formed, and challenging it feels socially and emotionally costly. What felt like competence was often just comfort wrapped in certainty, and the realization comes only after influence has already taken hold. Excessive benefit of the doubt granting. Excessive benefit of the doubt granting often feels like intellectual maturity. It comes from a desire to be fair, nuanced, and above emotional reactions. Intelligent people are trained to see multiple perspectives, to avoid snap judgments, and to assume complexity in human behavior. This habit begins as wisdom, but when applied indiscriminately, it becomes an open door. The danger lies in mistaking generosity for accuracy. When someone consistently explains away red flags as misunderstandings, stress, or poor communication, they are not being rational. They are postponing clarity. Manipulation thrives in delay. Each time harmful behavior is reinterpreted charitably, the window for intervention narrows, and the cost of acknowledgement grows. Manipulators rely on this tendency by behaving just well enough to justify doubt. They offer partial explanations, plausible excuses, or emotionally resonant backstories that invite sympathy. The intelligent mind steps in to contextualize, to soften conclusions, to remind itself that humans are flawed. Meanwhile, patterns are ignored because each instance is evaluated in isolation. There is also an emotional reward attached to being the reasonable one. Granting the benefit of the doubt reinforces self-image as fair-minded and emotionally advanced. This makes it harder to stop, because withdrawing that generosity feels like becoming cynical or unjust. The person fears overreacting more than being exploited. Over time, this habit creates self-betrayal. Intuition raises quiet alarms, but logic smothers them with empathy. By the time certainty arrives, damage has already occurred. The manipulation succeeds not because the person lacked intelligence, but because they valued fairness more than self-protection, unaware that discernment is not cruelty and clarity is not a moral failure. Emotional blind spots. Emotional blind spots form when intelligent people learn to value control over awareness. From an early age, they are often praised for staying calm, rational, and composed, especially in situations where others react emotionally. Over time, emotions become something to manage, suppress, or analyze rather than something to feel and listen to. This creates gaps in perception where feelings still operate, but without conscious recognition. These blind spots are dangerous because emotions do not disappear when ignored. They simply move underground. Attachment, fear, admiration, resentment, and desire continue to influence decisions, but without being named. The intelligent mind notices the conclusions, not the emotional currents that carried it there. This makes influence feel self-generated, even when it is not. Manipulators exploit these blind spots by activating emotions that the person does not consciously track. They create a sense of importance, belonging, urgency, or moral superiority, knowing the target will interpret their reactions as reasoned insight rather than emotional response. Because the emotion is invisible to the self, it cannot be questioned. There is also shame involved. Intelligent people often believe they should be above emotional influence. When strong feelings arise, they are reframed as intuition or dismissed as irrelevant. This prevents correction. The person defends their position with logic, unaware that the logic is protecting an emotional investment they never acknowledged. The most unsettling part of emotional blind spots is how convincing they feel. The person believes they are acting freely, independently, and thoughtfully. Meanwhile, decisions are being shaped by forces they cannot see, cannot name, and therefore cannot challenge. Influence does not need to overpower the mind. It only needs to stay hidden from awareness, and emotional blind spots provide the perfect place to hide. Underestimating social engineering. Underestimating social engineering comes from believing that manipulation requires intelligence greater than your own. Highly intelligent people often imagine deception as elaborate, technical, or intellectually complex. They expect trickery to arrive as a puzzle to be solved, not as a conversation to be trusted. This expectation creates a dangerous blind spot because social engineering rarely targets intelligence. It targets human nature. Social engineering works by exploiting predictability, not ignorance. It leverages politeness, curiosity, empathy, fear of awkwardness, and the desire to be helpful. Intelligent people are especially vulnerable because they pride themselves on being cooperative, informed, and capable. When someone approaches them confidently and speaks with apparent clarity, the interaction feels safe, even flattering. Manipulators do not need to lie convincingly. They only need to ask in the right way. A small request framed as reasonable opens the door. Once compliance happens, consistency takes over, and saying no later feels unjustified. The intelligent mind rationalizes each step, unaware that the structure of influence is being built emotionally, not logically. Another danger lies in familiarity. Social engineers often mirror competence, values, or shared language, making the interaction feel peer-to-peer. This lowers defenses further because suspicion feels unnecessary between equals. The intelligent person engages fully, believing awareness of manipulation techniques equals resistance to them. The most effective social engineering never feels like manipulation. It feels like normal interaction. By the time doubt surfaces, trust has already been established, information has already been shared, or commitment has already formed. The realization arrives too late, not because the person lacked intelligence, but because they underestimated how easily human behavior can be guided when it is wrapped in confidence, timing, and social comfort rather than force or deception. Desire for coherence. The desire for coherence is a deep psychological need that intelligent people feel with particular intensity. Coherence brings relief. It turns scattered information into meaning and transforms uncertainty into a story that makes sense. For a mind trained to analyze, connect, and synthesize, coherence feels like resolution. When pieces align, tension dissolves, and the mind experiences a quiet satisfaction that feels indistinguishable from truth. This desire becomes a vulnerability when coherence is mistaken for accuracy. Manipulators exploit this by offering narratives that neatly explain complex realities, even when those narratives leave out critical details. The intelligent mind, eager to resolve ambiguity, steps in to complete the picture. It fills gaps, smooths contradictions, and defends the structure because dismantling it would mean returning to discomfort. Emotionally, coherence provides a sense of control. A coherent explanation makes chaos feel manageable and restores the feeling of understanding. This is especially appealing during uncertainty, fear, or transition, when the mind is desperate for something solid to hold on to. In these moments, a clean narrative can feel like clarity, even if it is built on selective truths. Once a coherent story is accepted, opposing information begins to feel disruptive rather than informative. The mind treats contradictions as threats to stability, not invitations to reevaluate. Intelligent people may rationalize inconsistencies to protect the sense of order they have built, unaware that their need for things to make sense is being used against them. Manipulation thrives here because it does not need to convince fully. It only needs to offer a framework that feels complete. When coherence is achieved, skepticism quiets, the story feels finished, and the mind, relieved, stops asking the very questions that would have revealed what was missing all along. Tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for ambiguity is often celebrated as a marker of intelligence and emotional depth. It reflects an ability to sit with uncertainty, to resist premature conclusions, and to acknowledge that reality is rarely simple. Intelligent people pride themselves on not needing everything neatly resolved. They are comfortable saying, "It depends," and that comfort feels like wisdom. The danger emerges when ambiguity becomes a refuge rather than a temporary state. Manipulation thrives in uncertainty because it delays judgment and softens boundaries. When someone refuses to define what is happening, they also refuse to decide how to respond. The intelligent mind keeps exploring possibilities while the situation quietly continues in a harmful direction. Ambiguity allows patterns to hide. Each troubling signal is treated as an isolated event rather than part of a larger structure. Instead of asking what behavior means, the person asks what it could mean, generating endless explanations that prevent action. This intellectual openness becomes paralysis disguised as thoughtfulness. Emotionally, ambiguity reduces responsibility. As long as things are unclear, there is no need to confront, withdraw, or protect oneself. The discomfort of decisive action is postponed, even as unease grows. Manipulators sense this and exploit it by keeping messages vague, intentions undefined, and outcomes unresolved, knowing the other person will hesitate to draw conclusions. There is also identity at play. Clear boundaries can feel unsophisticated to someone who values nuance. Certainty feels crude, but ambiguity, when prolonged, erodes trust in one's own perception. The person begins doubting not the situation, but themselves. What makes this especially dangerous is that ambiguity feels intellectually virtuous. It feels patient, mature, and open-minded. In reality, it can quietly disable self-protection, allowing influence to deepen while the mind waits for clarity that will never arrive, because the lack of clarity is the tool being used. Belief that manipulation is obvious. The belief that manipulation is obvious gives intelligent people a false sense of safety. It rests on the assumption that influence looks dramatic, crude, or overt, that it announces itself through pressure, threats, or blatant lies. When someone expects manipulation to be loud, they stop listening for what is quiet. They scan for force and miss finesse. In reality, effective manipulation is subtle, patient, and emotionally calibrated. It rarely feels like being pushed. It feels like being understood. Intelligent people often believe they would immediately notice if someone were trying to influence them, not realizing that the most powerful manipulation never triggers resistance. It aligns, it agrees, it validates. By the time doubt arises, trust has already been established. This belief causes people to dismiss early warning signs. Small inconsistencies are rationalized. Discomfort is attributed to overthinking. Because nothing feels obviously wrong, the mind concludes that nothing is wrong at all. Manipulators rely on this delay. They move slowly, layering influence over time, knowing the target is waiting for something more dramatic before reacting. Emotionally, this belief flatters the self-image. It suggests perceptiveness and sophistication. Admitting manipulation can happen quietly, feels like admitting vulnerability, so the mind resists it. The person assumes that awareness alone is protection, even though awareness is rarely active when trust is present. The most dangerous part is that subtle manipulation feels like free choice. The person believes they are acting independently, following logic or values, unaware that their options have been gently narrowed. Nothing ever looked manipulative. Nothing raised alarms, and that is precisely why it worked. Resistance to simplistic warnings. Resistance to simplistic warnings develops when intelligence becomes closely tied to complexity. Intelligent people are trained to distrust anything that sounds too easy, too blunt, or too absolute. Simple warnings feel unsophisticated, alarmist, or intellectually lazy. The mind instinctively pushes back, assuming that if something were truly dangerous, it would require a more nuanced explanation. This creates a subtle but powerful vulnerability. Many real threats are simple by nature, but they are ignored because they do not satisfy the mind's expectation for depth. A clear warning triggers skepticism instead of caution. The intelligent person begins searching for hidden motives, oversights, or missing context, not realizing that simplicity is sometimes a feature, not a flaw. Manipulators exploit this resistance by burying danger under layers of explanation. They add nuance, complexity, and intellectual framing to make harmful behavior seem reasonable, debatable, or premature to judge. Meanwhile, straightforward cautions from others are dismissed as emotional reactions or lack of understanding. The person trusts the sophisticated voice over the blunt one, even when the blunt one is correct. Emotionally, this resistance protects ego. Taking a simple warning seriously can feel like admitting vulnerability or conceding that something obvious was missed. It feels safer to believe the situation is more complex than it appears. Complexity buys time, and time benefits the manipulator. What makes this especially dangerous is that many warnings are meant to interrupt, not persuade. They are designed to trigger pause, not debate. But when the intelligent mind turns every warning into an intellectual exercise, action is delayed until clarity feels complete. By the time the situation finally becomes complex enough to deserve attention, the damage is already unfolding, quietly confirming what the simple warning tried to prevent. Habit of rationalizing red flags. The habit of rationalizing red flags develops slowly in intelligent people, often disguised as fairness, patience, or depth of understanding. When something feels wrong, the mind does not immediately reject it. Instead, it begins searching for explanations. Maybe there is missing context. Maybe the behavior was misunderstood. Maybe it is more complex than it appears. This reflex feels responsible, even compassionate, and it is reinforced by years of being praised for nuanced thinking. The problem is that red flags are emotional signals, not logical arguments. They are designed to alert, not to persuade. Intelligent minds, however, often treat discomfort as a puzzle to solve rather than a warning to heed. Each unsettling moment becomes an intellectual exercise, and with enough reasoning, almost anything can be explained away. Manipulators rely on this pattern. They introduce small inconsistencies, boundary violations, or unsettling behaviors knowing they will not be confronted directly. The intelligent person will smooth them over internally, telling themselves that judgment without certainty would be unfair. In doing so, they quietly train themselves to tolerate more than they should. Emotionally, rationalizing red flags protects self-image. Admitting something is wrong would require admitting vulnerability or misjudgment. It feels safer to reinterpret than to retreat. Over time, this creates a dangerous normalization of discomfort. What once felt alarming begins to feel familiar, then acceptable. By the time the evidence becomes undeniable, the emotional investment is already deep. Trust has been extended repeatedly in small increments. Each rationalization has pushed the boundary further. The realization does not arrive as a sudden shock, but as a heavy recognition that the mind was working tirelessly to protect a situation that never deserved the benefit of the doubt in the first place. Trust in credentials and authority. Trust in credentials and authority feels rational, even necessary, in a world overflowing with information. Intelligent people understand that expertise matters, that years of study, titles, and institutional backing usually signal competence. Deferring to authority becomes a cognitive shortcut, a way to conserve mental energy and avoid reinventing knowledge that others have already earned. The vulnerability appears when credentials replace scrutiny. Once authority is established, the mind relaxes. Claims are evaluated less aggressively. Inconsistencies are attributed to complexity rather than error. The person stops asking whether something is true and starts asking how someone so qualified must be right. Manipulation thrives in this shift because authority does not need to convince, it only needs to speak. Emotionally, authority provides safety. It relieves the burden of uncertainty and responsibility. Trusting an expert feels like aligning with order and legitimacy rather than chaos and doubt. Intelligent people, especially those who value structure and systems, are deeply drawn to this sense of grounding. Challenging authority then begins to feel reckless, arrogant, or ignorant. Manipulators exploit this by borrowing credibility. They reference institutions, cite impressive-sounding affiliations, or surround themselves with symbols of legitimacy. Once the image is accepted, influence flows easily. The intelligent mind assumes that deception would be too costly, too visible, too unlikely at that level. There is also a social risk at play. Questioning authority can isolate you. It can make you appear difficult or contrarian. To avoid this, doubts are softened, postponed, or silenced internally. Over time, trust turns into obedience disguised as respect. The most dangerous part is that intelligence often reinforces this trap. The smarter the person, the more convincing the authority structure appears. And when authority is wrong or self-serving, intelligence becomes a tool for justifying trust rather than questioning it, long after warning signs have already surfaced. Intellectual empathy for manipulators. Intellectual empathy for manipulators arises when understanding replaces caution. Intelligent people are skilled at perspective taking. They can see how experiences shape behavior, how incentives drive actions, how context explains choices. This ability feels humane and sophisticated, but when misapplied, it becomes a doorway for exploitation. Instead of responding to harmful behavior with boundaries, the intelligent mind responds with explanations. It asks why rather than whether. It reframes manipulation as insecurity, strategy as survival, deception as complexity. Each act of understanding softens the emotional signal that something is wrong. The person begins to relate to the manipulator as a puzzle to be solved rather than a threat to be avoided. Manipulators thrive on this. They offer partial truths, vulnerable stories, or intellectual justifications that invite analysis and sympathy. The intelligent person feels compelled to be fair, nuanced, and charitable, even when doing so costs them safety or clarity. Calling out behavior feels reductive. Setting boundaries feels unsophisticated. Emotionally, this creates a trap. Empathy generates connection, and connection generates hesitation. The more the person understands the manipulator's perspective, the harder it becomes to act decisively. Discomfort is reframed as moral responsibility rather than warning. The most dangerous aspect is how righteous this empathy feels. It aligns with values of depth, fairness, and intelligence, yet it quietly shifts loyalty away from the self. By the time the intelligent person recognizes the pattern, they are already invested in defending someone who does not extend the same empathy in return. Understanding becomes a leash, and insight becomes the very thing that keeps them close to harm. Attraction to clever narratives. Attraction to clever narratives is a natural byproduct of an intelligent mind that loves patterns, meaning, and coherence. Intelligent people are drawn to stories that explain the world elegantly, that connect scattered facts into something that feels insightful. A clever narrative doesn't just inform, it flatters the listener by making them feel like they finally see what others don't. That feeling is intoxicating. Manipulators understand that facts alone rarely persuade. Stories do. A well-crafted narrative gives events a direction, assigns roles, and offers emotional resolution. When the narrative is clever, layered, ironic, or contrarian, it signals intelligence. The listener relaxes, assuming that anything this sophisticated must be grounded in truth. Skepticism fades, replaced by admiration. The danger is that narratives can be internally brilliant and externally false. They can explain everything while being anchored to selective facts, omissions, or emotional framing. Intelligent people often evaluate how well a story fits together rather than how well it corresponds to reality. If the narrative reduces confusion and increases clarity, it feels correct, even when it isn't. Emotionally, clever narratives offer belonging. They create an in-group of those who understand. Once someone identifies with the story, questioning it feels like losing insight, status, or identity. The mind begins defending the narrative not because it is accurate, but because it feels meaningful. What makes this especially dangerous is that narratives shape perception before evidence is evaluated. New information is filtered to fit the story rather than challenge it. The intelligent person believes they are thinking independently, unaware that their attraction to elegance and insight has quietly handed control to whoever authored the story. The narrative doesn't just explain reality, it replaces it, one satisfying insight at a time. Difficulty accepting personal bias. Difficulty accepting personal bias is one of the most emotionally protected blind spots in intelligent people. Intelligence is often built around the idea of objectivity, seeing clearly, thinking independently, rising above distortion. Over time, this creates an internal identity where bias is something other people have. To admit personal bias feels like undermining the very foundation of self-trust. This resistance does not come from ignorance, but from pride and fear intertwined. Intelligent individuals usually understand cognitive bias in theory, but emotionally exempt themselves from it. They believe awareness equals correction. Because they can explain bias, they assume they have already neutralized it. This belief shuts down deeper self-examination before it even begins. Manipulation thrives here because bias rarely announces itself as bias. It feels like preference, intuition, or well-reasoned judgment. When influence aligns with existing beliefs, values, or self-image, the mind welcomes it as confirmation rather than distortion. The intelligent person becomes especially vulnerable to narratives that flatter their worldview because rejecting them would require questioning not just an idea, but their own discernment. Emotionally, admitting bias threatens competence and control. It introduces uncertainty where certainty once lived. So instead of confronting it, the mind defends its conclusions more aggressively. Evidence is filtered. Counterpoints are reframed as exceptions. The person becomes convinced they are thinking critically, when in reality they are protecting an internal story about themselves. The most dangerous part is that bias feels invisible from the inside. It feels like clarity. It feels like insight. And because the intelligent mind trusts itself deeply, it rarely pauses long enough to ask whether its confidence is coming from truth or from an unexamined attachment it refuses to let go of. Over-reliance on data without context. Over-reliance on data without context is a vulnerability that hides behind precision. Intelligent people are taught to trust numbers, studies, metrics, and measurable outcomes. Data feels objective, clean, and immune to bias. When something is quantified, it appears solid, as if reality itself has spoken. This creates a deep sense of confidence that feels earned and responsible. The problem is that data never exists in isolation. It is collected by someone, framed in a certain way, and presented for a purpose. When context is stripped away, data becomes a tool of influence rather than insight. Manipulation exploits this by overwhelming the mind with statistics that are technically accurate but strategically incomplete. The intelligent mind focuses on validity while missing intention. Emotionally, data provides distance. Numbers feel safer than stories. They allow people to avoid discomfort, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity. This makes it easier to accept conclusions that feel rational while ignoring the human consequences behind them. The person believes they are being objective, unaware that emotional disengagement is part of the manipulation. Selective data also creates false certainty. When only certain variables are shown, the mind fills in the gaps with assumptions that align with the presented narrative. Contradictory information feels irrelevant or anecdotal. The more data appears, the less the person questions what is missing. There is also pride involved. Interpreting data correctly becomes a marker of intelligence. Admitting that numbers can mislead feels like intellectual failure. So the person defends the data set instead of questioning its construction. The danger is not in trusting data, but in surrendering judgment to it. Without context, data becomes persuasive rather than informative. And when intelligence mistakes precision for truth, it can be guided quietly, convincingly, and confidently toward conclusions that serve someone else's agenda. Discounting gut feelings. Discounting gut feelings is one of the most common habits intelligent people develop in the name of reason. From early on, they learn to distrust impulses, to question instincts, to replace immediate reactions with analysis. Over time, intuition becomes associated with error, bias, or irrationality, while thinking things through becomes the gold standard. This creates a quiet disconnection from a powerful internal signal. Gut feelings are not mystical. They are rapid, unconscious pattern recognition built from experience, observation, and emotional memory. When something feels off, the body often notices long before the mind can explain why. Intelligent people tend to override this signal, believing that if they cannot justify it logically, it does not deserve attention. Manipulators rely on this delay. They create situations that feel slightly wrong but look reasonable on the surface. The intelligent mind talks itself out of discomfort, labeling it as anxiety, projection, or overthinking. Each time this happens, trust shifts away from intuition and toward external narratives. Emotionally, ignoring gut feelings creates vulnerability. The body raises a quiet alarm, but the mind silences it to maintain coherence and control. This makes manipulation feel smooth because resistance never fully forms. The person remains engaged, polite, curious, and open, even as subtle unease builds beneath awareness. The most dangerous part is the aftermath. When manipulation becomes clear later, the person often remembers the early feeling they ignored. This realization creates self-blame rather than learning. They conclude they should have thought better, not listened more closely, and so the pattern repeats, with intuition dismissed again, while influence continues to operate in the space where logic demands proof but instinct already knows. Assumption that motives are transparent. The assumption that motives are transparent comes from a deep reliance on clarity, honesty, and internal consistency. Intelligent people often believe that if someone's actions make sense and their words align logically, then their intentions must be visible. They expect motives to announce themselves through reasoning, tone, or explanation. When something appears coherent, the search for hidden intent quietly stops. This assumption feels reasonable because it mirrors how intelligent people often operate themselves. They explain their thinking, justify their choices, and assume others do the same. But manipulation thrives in this projection. Many people act with layered or concealed motives, not because they are chaotic, but because revealing intent would reduce effectiveness. Manipulators take advantage of this by offering plausible surface reasons that satisfy intellectual curiosity while concealing deeper goals. The explanation sounds rational, even considerate, so the intelligent mind accepts it as sufficient. It doesn't feel necessary to ask what benefits the other person gains or what pressures might be influencing their behavior, because the stated motive feels complete. Emotionally, this creates a false sense of safety. Transparency feels like trust, and trust feels like stability. Questioning motives begins to feel suspicious or unfair, especially when the other person presents themselves as reasonable and articulate. The intelligent person worries more about misjudging than being misled. What makes this especially dangerous is that hidden motives rarely reveal themselves through contradiction. They reveal themselves through patterns over time, incentives, and outcomes. But when transparency is assumed, patterns are ignored and outcomes are rationalized. The person keeps believing they understand what is happening, unaware that they are responding to a carefully curated surface while the real intentions remain quietly protected beneath it. Desire to win. Arguments, not assess intent. The desire to win arguments rather than assess intent is a vulnerability that hides behind intellectual skill. Intelligent people are often trained through debate, discussion, and analysis to sharpen their reasoning and defend positions effectively. Over time, conversations begin to feel like contests of logic, where clarity, precision, and rhetorical strength are rewarded. Winning feels like proof of competence, and losing feels like a failure of thought. This focus quietly shifts attention away from motive. Instead of asking why someone is saying something, the mind concentrates on how to respond. Energy is spent crafting counterpoints, spotting flaws, and refining explanations. Meanwhile, intent, whether the other person is being honest, manipulative, or strategic, goes largely unexamined. The argument becomes the surface on which everything plays out. Manipulators exploit this by keeping the discussion alive without ever committing to truth. They provoke, deflect, and reframe, knowing the intelligent person will stay engaged as long as there is something to argue against. Each exchange feels productive, but the real outcome is exhaustion and gradual concession, not understanding. Emotionally, argument can feel empowering. It creates the illusion of control and progress. The intelligent mind believes that if it can just explain better, clarify further, or dismantle one more point, the situation will resolve. This belief keeps them invested long after they should have disengaged. By the time intent becomes obvious, the cost of acknowledging it feels high. Time has been spent, identity has been invested, and walking away feels like surrender. What the person does not realize is that the moment they treated the interaction as a debate rather than a threat assessment, they stopped protecting themselves and gave manipulation the exact arena it needed to succeed. Belief that logic defeats deception. The belief that logic defeats deception is comforting because it places control in the mind. Intelligent people often assume that lies collapse under scrutiny, that falsehoods cannot survive careful reasoning, and that truth naturally reveals itself when examined closely. This creates a sense of security. As long as I think clearly, I am safe. The flaw in this belief is that deception rarely competes on logic alone. It operates on timing, emotion, framing, and trust. By the time logic engages, the direction has often already been set. Manipulation does not need to win an argument. It only needs to shape what questions are asked and when. The intelligent mind focuses on consistency while deception quietly controls relevance. There is also a delay built into logic. Reasoning takes time, and deception exploits speed. Emotional reactions, social pressure, and urgency push decisions forward before analysis is complete. Intelligent people may notice inconsistencies later, but by then, commitments have been made, loyalties formed, or narratives internalized. Emotionally, this belief creates blind confidence. It encourages people to engage manipulators directly, to debate them, to outthink them. This is exactly what skilled deceivers want. Debate provides access, attention, and legitimacy. Each exchange deepens involvement, making withdrawal harder and self-justification stronger. When logic fails to expose the deception immediately, the person often blames themselves rather than questioning the belief. They assume they need more information, more reasoning, more time. This keeps them engaged longer than they should be. The most dangerous aspect is that logic is reactive, while deception is strategic. Logic responds to what is presented. Deception decides what gets presented in the first place. When intelligence assumes logic is enough, it underestimates the battlefield, and in that gap between reasoning and reality, influence settles in quietly, protected by the very confidence meant to prevent it. Neglect of emotional self-defense. Neglect of emotional self-defense happens when intelligent people believe awareness is enough. They study psychology, understand influence, and can name tactics when they see them in others. This creates the illusion that knowledge alone provides protection. Emotional boundaries are seen as unnecessary or even unsophisticated, something for people who lack self-control or insight. The problem is that emotions do not ask for permission. They react instantly to tone, validation, rejection, fear, and belonging. Without deliberate emotional self-defense, these reactions are left unguarded. Intelligent people often expose themselves fully in conversations, debates, and relationships, believing openness is strength and restraint is weakness. Manipulators exploit this openness by applying emotional pressure while appearing reasonable. They use guilt, admiration, urgency, or moral framing to bypass logic and target emotional needs directly. Because the intelligent person is focused on ideas, not emotional impact, they fail to notice when their internal state is being shaped. Emotionally, this neglect creates exhaustion. The person feels drained, confused, or unsettled after interactions, but cannot explain why. Instead of recognizing influence, they assume the problem is internal. This keeps them engaged longer, trying to resolve discomfort through more conversation rather than distance. The most dangerous part is that emotional self-defense feels unnecessary until it is too late. By the time the intelligent person considers pulling back, emotional hooks are already in place. Trust has formed. Investment has grown. Without boundaries, influence does not need force. It simply walks in through the open door, settles quietly, and reshapes decisions while the mind remains convinced it is still in control. High openness to new ideas. High openness to new ideas is often celebrated as a hallmark of intelligence. It signals curiosity, flexibility, and a willingness to grow beyond rigid thinking. Intelligent people take pride in not being dogmatic, in questioning assumptions, and in exploring unfamiliar perspectives. This openness feels like intellectual courage. It is also one of the easiest traits to exploit. Manipulation enters through novelty. New ideas carry emotional energy, excitement, insight, the feeling of expansion. When something challenges existing beliefs in a clever or unexpected way, the intelligent mind leans in rather than pulling back. Skepticism is temporarily suspended, not out of naivety, but out of respect for the possibility of learning something valuable. Manipulators frame influence as exploration. They present ideas as questions, alternatives, or thought experiments rather than directives. This disarms resistance, because rejecting the idea feels like rejecting curiosity itself. The intelligent person stays engaged longer than they should, believing that openness requires endurance, not boundaries. Emotionally, openness becomes tied to identity. Being receptive feels virtuous. Closing off feels regressive. This creates internal pressure to tolerate discomfort, contradiction, or subtle coercion in the name of growth. The person begins rationalizing why something unsettling must be worth considering, rather than why it feels wrong. What makes this especially dangerous is that openness without selectivity invites occupation. Not all ideas deserve equal access to the mind. Some are designed to confuse, destabilize, or redirect rather than enlighten. But when openness is treated as a moral good rather than a strategic choice, the intelligent person mistakes exposure for wisdom, unaware that influence often enters not by force but by invitation, quietly reshaping beliefs under the guise of exploration. Confusing skepticism with cynicism. Confusing skepticism with cynicism is a subtle mental shift that quietly disarms intelligent people. Skepticism is meant to question claims while remaining open to truth. Cynicism, however, assumes deception everywhere and believes nothing is genuine. When the two blur together, the mind begins to treat doubt as a personality trait rather than a tool. Intelligent people often pride themselves on being skeptical, but that pride can harden into a detached, dismissive stance. They believe they are protected because they question everything, yet cynicism creates emotional distance rather than discernment. Instead of carefully evaluating motives, they disengage emotionally, assuming manipulation is obvious and unsophisticated. This is where the vulnerability forms. Cynicism lowers vigilance. When someone appears sincere, nuanced, or self-aware, the cynical mind relaxes, believing true manipulators would be more blatant. Subtle influence slips through because it doesn't match the crude caricature of manipulation the person expects. Emotionally, cynicism also breeds fatigue. Constant doubt becomes exhausting, so the mind begins to conserve energy by choosing what feels worth questioning. Trusted sources, familiar narratives, or flattering perspectives are given a pass. Skepticism should sharpen attention. Cynicism blunts it. Manipulators exploit this by presenting themselves as transparent, critical, or even cynical themselves. Shared disillusionment feels like alignment. The intelligent person mistakes this emotional resonance for safety, unaware that their guard has dropped not because they verified anything, but because the tone felt familiar. In the end, cynicism replaces curiosity. Instead of asking better questions, the person assumes they already see through things, and that assumption, mistaken for intelligence, becomes the very opening that allows influence to take hold quietly without resistance, under the comforting illusion of being too skeptical to be fooled. Assuming others share ethical standards. Assuming others share ethical standards is a quiet act of projection that feels humane and fair. Intelligent people often believe that most individuals operate within similar moral boundaries, valuing honesty, reciprocity, and good faith. This assumption makes the world feel predictable and manageable. It allows trust to form without constant vigilance, and that trust feels like maturity rather than risk. The vulnerability appears when this assumption goes unchallenged. Not everyone plays by the same rules. Some people see ethics as flexible tools rather than guiding principles. Manipulation exploits this gap by behaving just ethically enough to pass surface checks while violating deeper norms. The intelligent mind struggles to accept this because recognizing it would require rewriting its model of human behavior. Emotionally, acknowledging bad faith is unsettling. It introduces chaos into a system the mind wants to keep ordered. So instead of confronting the possibility that someone is intentionally exploiting them, the person looks for misunderstandings, stressors, or unintentional harm. Ethics are assumed. Intent is softened. This assumption also disables self-protection. Boundaries feel unnecessary when you believe the other person will stop themselves. Warnings are dismissed because no reasonable person would do that. Manipulators rely on this hesitation. They push just past what is acceptable, knowing the response will be confusion rather than resistance. There is also a social reward for moral projection. Believing others are ethical reinforces one's own identity as ethical and enlightened. Suspicion begins to feel cynical or cruel. The intelligent person chooses kindness over clarity, unaware that clarity is not the opposite of compassion. The danger is not in having standards, but in assuming they are universal. When intelligence confuses shared values with shared behavior, it becomes blind to exploitation. And by the time the ethical gap becomes undeniable, trust has already been invested, leverage has shifted, and walking away feels far more costly than it ever should have been. Tendency to self-blame. The tendency to self-blame is deeply ingrained in intelligent people because responsibility feels safer than randomness. When something goes wrong, they instinctively look inward, assuming there must be something they missed, misunderstood, or failed to account for. This habit is often praised as maturity and accountability, but it quietly distorts perception in situations involving manipulation. When discomfort arises in an interaction, self-blame redirects attention away from the other person. Instead of questioning intent, behavior, or honesty, the intelligent mind interrogates itself. Confusion becomes evidence of insufficient clarity. Emotional unease becomes a sign of personal insecurity. Manipulators benefit enormously from this reflex because they do not need to defend their actions if the other person is already defending them. Self-blame also delays boundary setting. Calling something out feels premature when you believe the issue might be your fault. The intelligent person waits for certainty, for proof, for a cleaner explanation. During that wait, influence deepens. Each moment of hesitation reinforces the manipulator's control over the narrative. Emotionally, self-blame creates dependency. When someone else offers reassurance, interpretation, or correction, it feels stabilizing. The manipulator becomes the reference point for reality, subtly shaping how events are understood. The intelligent person trusts the external explanation over their own experience. The most damaging aspect of self-blame is how invisible it feels. It masquerades as honesty and depth. By the time the person realizes they have been manipulated, they often turn the blame inward again, concluding they should have known better. This preserves the pattern. The mind remains critical of itself, while the true source of harm remains unexamined and free to repeat the behavior. Tendency to self-blame. The tendency to self-blame runs deep in intelligent people because control feels safer than uncertainty. When something feels wrong, the mind immediately turns inward, searching for flaws in perception, reasoning, or behavior. This habit is often reinforced by praise for being reflective, accountable, and self-aware. Over time, responsibility becomes reflexive, and suspicion is redirected away from others and aimed squarely at the self. In situations involving manipulation, this reflex becomes dangerous. When boundaries are crossed or discomfort arises, the intelligent person assumes they misunderstood, overreacted, or failed to communicate clearly. Instead of questioning intent, they question competence. Manipulators benefit enormously from this pattern because it absolves them without effort. The target does the work for them. Self-blame creates hesitation. It delays confrontation and softens resistance. The intelligent person waits for certainty they will never receive because manipulation thrives in ambiguity. Each pause reinforces the manipulator's position, allowing them to redefine events while the other person is busy correcting themselves. Emotionally, self-blame erodes trust in instinct. The person learns to doubt their reactions, feelings, and perceptions. When the manipulator offers explanations, reassurance, or reframing, it feels grounding. Relief is mistaken for truth. The external narrative replaces internal signals. The most insidious part is how noble self-blame feels. It aligns with intelligence, humility, and moral seriousness, yet it quietly shifts accountability away from harmful behavior and onto the person being harmed. By the time awareness arrives, the intelligent person often blames themselves again for not seeing it sooner, reinforcing the cycle. The mind becomes both the victim and the enforcer, while the true source of manipulation remains untouched. Overanalyzing instead of disengaging. Overanalyzing instead of disengaging is a habit that forms when intelligence is rewarded for persistence and problem-solving. Intelligent people are taught that if something is confusing, the answer is more thought, more analysis, more engagement. Walking away feels like failure, avoidance, or intellectual laziness. So when a situation feels off, the instinct is not to exit, but to understand. Manipulators rely on this reflex. Confusion keeps people present. The more unclear the situation becomes, the more the intelligent mind digs in, believing clarity is just one insight away. Each new inconsistency is treated as a puzzle rather than a warning. The person stays engaged not because it feels right, but because it feels unfinished. Emotionally, overanalyzing creates the illusion of control. Thinking feels active and safe, while disengaging feels abrupt and unjustified. The mind convinces itself that leaving without full understanding would be irrational. Meanwhile, emotional exhaustion builds, and with it, vulnerability. Tired minds accept explanations they would normally question, simply to resolve the tension. Manipulation doesn't need to convince, it only needs to delay exit. As long as the intelligent person remains engaged, influence can continue. Boundaries soften under the weight of prolonged consideration. What should have been a quick no turns into a long internal debate. The most dangerous part is that disengagement rarely comes with intellectual closure. There is no perfect explanation, no final clarity, no satisfying conclusion. Manipulators know this. They exploit the mind's need for resolution, keeping the conversation just coherent enough to justify staying. By the time the person realizes they should have walked away, the opportunity to do so cleanly has already passed, replaced by entanglement disguised as understanding. Difficulty saying no politely. Difficulty saying no politely is a vulnerability that grows out of intelligence, empathy, and social awareness colliding. Intelligent people are often highly attuned to nuance, tone, and the emotional consequences of their actions. They can see multiple perspectives at once, which makes refusal feel complicated rather than simple. Saying no is rarely just a boundary. It feels like a potential misunderstanding, an unnecessary harm, or a failure to communicate well. This creates hesitation. Instead of a clear refusal, the mind searches for a softer path. Maybe later, maybe with conditions, maybe after explaining thoroughly. The intelligent person believes that if they can just phrase it correctly, no one will feel rejected. But in trying to be kind, they leave doors open that should have been closed. Manipulators depend on this ambiguity. They listen carefully for hesitation, not agreement. A vague response, an over-explanation, or a polite delay is interpreted as opportunity. Each time the boundary is softened, pressure increases slightly, always framed as reasonable, understanding, or minor. The intelligent person feels trapped by their own courtesy, unsure how to retreat without seeming rude or inconsistent. Emotionally, saying no threatens identity. Many intelligent people see themselves as fair, helpful, and reasonable. A firm refusal feels cold, even unethical, especially when the other person frames their request as logical or justified. This discomfort leads to compliance disguised as patience. Over time, the cost accumulates quietly. Energy is drained. Obligations multiply. Resentment builds beneath a surface of politeness. The person realizes too late that clarity would have been kinder than accommodation, and that manipulation rarely begins with force. It begins with a request that feels small, reasonable, and just uncomfortable enough to say no to, especially for someone who cares deeply about being understood. Belief that manipulation targets the ignorant. The belief that manipulation targets the ignorant is one of the most protective myths intelligent people tell themselves. It creates a clear divide between those who fall for things and those who understand. In this story, manipulation is crude, obvious, and designed for people who lack education, awareness, or critical thinking. Intelligence becomes a shield, and that belief feels reassuring. The problem is that manipulation is not designed to bypass intelligence. It is designed to use it. Skilled manipulators do not rely on simplistic lies. They rely on complexity, nuance, and intellectual flattery. They speak the language of reason, values, and sophistication because that is where intelligent minds feel most at home. The belief that only the ignorant are targeted causes the intelligent person to lower their guard precisely when they should raise it. Emotionally, this belief feeds pride. It allows people to distance themselves from vulnerability and maintain a sense of superiority. Admitting that intelligence does not protect against influence feels humiliating, so the possibility is dismissed before it is examined. Warning signs are reframed as things that someone less sharp might worry about. This belief also delays recognition. When influence begins to take hold, the person does not interpret it as manipulation, because manipulation is something that happens to others. They assume they are choosing freely, thinking independently, arriving at conclusions through merit. By the time discomfort arises, it is already entangled with identity and justification. The most dangerous part is that intelligent people make better targets, not worse ones. They rationalize more effectively, defend more convincingly, and invest more deeply in narratives that flatter their intellect. When manipulation finally becomes visible, it does not look like deception. It looks like insight. And because the person never believed they could be targeted, they never thought to look for the trap at all. Desire to be fair at all costs. The desire to be fair at all costs is one of the most socially rewarded traits in intelligent people, and one of the most easily exploited. Fairness feels like integrity. It signals depth, maturity, and moral seriousness. For someone who values truth and balance, being unfair feels worse than being wrong. This creates a powerful internal pressure to always consider every side, even when one side is acting in bad faith. Manipulators rely on this instinct. They exploit the intelligent person's reluctance to judge too quickly by constantly reframing their behavior as misunderstood, complex, or context-dependent. The desire to be fair keeps the target engaged, listening, and reconsidering long after a boundary should have been set. Harmful actions are treated as debatable perspectives rather than warning signs. Emotionally, fairness becomes a trap. The intelligent person suppresses anger, discomfort, or suspicion to avoid seeming biased or reactive. These emotions are labeled as irrational and set aside, even though they often carry important information. In their place, reasoned neutrality takes over, creating space for influence to grow. The need for fairness also delays action. Decisive responses feel reckless without complete information. Manipulators exploit this by withholding clarity, shifting narratives, and introducing endless nuance. Each new detail resets the process, keeping the intelligent person stuck in evaluation mode. The most dangerous aspect is that fairness feels virtuous even when it is self-destructive. The person believes they are acting ethically, unaware that fairness without boundaries becomes permission. By the time the cost is clear, the habit is already entrenched, and the desire to be fair has quietly overridden the instinct to protect oneself. Intellectual curiosity exploited. Intellectual curiosity is one of the most powerful drivers of intelligent behavior. It pushes people to ask questions, explore unknown territory, and engage with ideas that challenge them. Curiosity feels virtuous, even noble. It signals growth, depth, and openness. But when curiosity overrides caution, it becomes a doorway rather than a safeguard. Manipulators exploit curiosity by dangling unanswered questions, partial truths, and intriguing inconsistencies. They offer just enough information to spark interest, then withhold clarity. The intelligent mind leans forward, compelled to resolve the tension. What begins as exploration slowly turns into investment, not because the situation is safe, but because it is unfinished. Curiosity also creates tolerance for risk. The desire to know outweighs the instinct to protect. Red flags are reframed as mysteries. Discomfort becomes part of the learning process. The person stays engaged longer than they should, telling themselves that understanding requires exposure, unaware that exposure itself is shaping them. Emotionally, curiosity hooks into identity. Being the kind of person who explores difficult or forbidden ideas feels empowering. Walking away feels like intellectual cowardice or missed opportunity. Manipulators understand this and frame influence as rare access, insider knowledge, or deeper truth, knowing the intelligent mind hates leaving a question unanswered. What makes this especially dangerous is that curiosity does not discriminate between insight and harm. It pulls the mind toward whatever promises novelty or understanding, regardless of intent. By the time clarity arrives, the person is no longer just observing. They are entangled. And disentangling now requires admitting that curiosity, once a strength, was quietly used as leverage rather than fuel for genuine understanding. Tolerance for discomfort. Tolerance for discomfort is often praised as resilience, maturity, and emotional strength, especially in intelligent people. They learn early that growth requires tension, that insight often emerges from unease, and that difficult truths rarely feel pleasant. Over time, discomfort stops being a signal and starts being normalized. Enduring it becomes proof of depth, patience, and intellectual seriousness. This is where the vulnerability forms. Not all discomfort is meaningful, and not all tension leads to growth. Some discomfort exists to warn, not to teach. Intelligent people, however, are skilled at sitting with unease and interpreting it. Instead of asking whether something is wrong, they ask what they can learn from it. That shift keeps them engaged long past the point where withdrawal would be safer. Manipulators rely on this endurance. They introduce pressure gradually, knowing it will be tolerated. Awkwardness, boundary violations, emotional strain, or moral tension are framed as complexity, nuance, or necessary difficulty. The intelligent person stays, believing that leaving would mean avoiding something important or failing to fully understand the situation. Emotionally, tolerance for discomfort becomes intertwined with identity. Walking away feels like weakness. Setting limits feels premature. The person convinces themselves that strength lies in staying present, thinking harder, enduring longer. Meanwhile, the discomfort intensifies, not because something profound is unfolding, but because boundaries are being quietly eroded. The most dangerous aspect is that tolerance dulls sensitivity. What once felt alarming becomes familiar. The nervous system adapts, and warning signals lose their urgency. By the time the person recognizes that the discomfort is no longer productive, it has already reshaped their expectations. Manipulation does not need to overpower them. It only needs to wait until endurance replaces self-protection, and discomfort is mistaken for depth rather than danger. Valuing nuance over boundaries. Valuing nuance over boundaries feels like intellectual and emotional sophistication. Intelligent people are trained to see gradients rather than absolutes, to resist rigid rules, and to appreciate context. Clear lines can feel crude, even immature, compared to the elegance of flexible thinking. Nuance signals depth, empathy, and understanding, and that identity is deeply appealing. The vulnerability appears when nuance replaces self-protection. Boundaries exist to limit harm, not to oversimplify reality. When every violation is met with interpretation rather than response, manipulation gains time and space. The intelligent mind keeps asking why instead of deciding what is acceptable. Each boundary becomes negotiable, each discomfort open for discussion. Manipulators exploit this by living in the gray. They push limits subtly, then retreat just enough to invite analysis. Was it intentional or accidental, harmful or misunderstood? The person engages intellectually, weighing possibilities while the behavior continues. Nuance becomes a fog that hides patterns. Emotionally, boundaries feel confrontational. They risk conflict, rejection, or appearing inflexible. Nuance feels safer. It allows the person to stay connected while postponing decisive action. Over time, this creates emotional exhaustion because clarity is constantly deferred in favor of understanding. There is also pride involved. Having strong boundaries can feel unsophisticated to someone who values complexity. Saying, "This is not okay," feels too simple for a mind accustomed to layered reasoning. But manipulation does not respect complexity, it exploits hesitation. The most dangerous aspect is that boundaries do not require certainty, only self-trust. When nuance is valued above all else, self-trust erodes. The person becomes endlessly accommodating, believing they are being wise, while influence tightens quietly. What feels like openness slowly becomes erosion, not because the person lacked intelligence, but because they mistook depth for durability. Assuming honesty in debate. Assuming honesty in debate is a natural extension of valuing truth, but it becomes a vulnerability when applied indiscriminately. Intelligent people often enter discussions believing that disagreement is a shared search for understanding. They listen closely, respond carefully, and refine ideas as if everyone involved is operating with the same goal. This assumption creates a baseline of trust that lowers defenses before intentions are ever assessed. Manipulators exploit this by treating debate not as exploration, but as leverage. They argue to confuse, exhaust, or dominate rather than to clarify. While the intelligent person responds to points as they are presented, the manipulator shifts positions, redefines terms, and selectively ignores counterarguments. The debate becomes asymmetrical, but the assumption of honesty keeps the target playing by rules the other side does not follow. Emotionally, this creates disorientation. The intelligent person feels compelled to stay engaged, believing clarity is just one more explanation away. When frustration arises, it is suppressed to maintain civility and intellectual integrity. The manipulator benefits from this restraint, gaining time and control while appearing reasonable. Assuming honesty also discourages boundary setting. Walking away feels like intellectual failure or avoidance. The intelligent person stays longer than they should, trying to resolve what was never meant to be resolved. The most dangerous part is how invisible this assumption is. It feels like virtue, not vulnerability. By the time the person realizes the debate was never honest, they are already emotionally invested, mentally fatigued, and subtly influenced. The exchange did not need to convince them outright. It only needed to keep them engaged long enough for doubt, confusion, and misplaced trust to take hold. Excessive respect for expertise. Excessive respect for expertise develops when intelligence is conditioned to defer to authority wrapped in credentials, titles, or specialized language. Intelligent people understand how long mastery takes, how complex fields can be, and how dangerous ignorance is. As a result, they often give experts the benefit of the doubt before questioning motives or assumptions. This respect feels rational, humble, and disciplined. It is also deeply exploitable. Manipulators hide comfortably behind expertise. They use technical language, references, and confidence to create asymmetry in understanding. The intelligent listener assumes that confusion means they lack knowledge, not that something is being obscured. Doubt turns inward instead of outward. The person hesitates to challenge claims, fearing they might reveal ignorance or misunderstand nuance they are not qualified to assess. Emotionally, expertise carries authority and safety. Trusting experts reduces uncertainty and cognitive load. It feels responsible to listen, to comply, to assume good faith. But this trust can quietly replace critical evaluation with deference. The intelligent mind stops asking whether the expert's incentives align with the truth, focusing only on whether their credentials justify belief. Over time, this creates dependency. The expert's interpretation becomes the lens through which reality is understood. Contradictory evidence is dismissed as misunderstanding. Skepticism feels disrespectful rather than necessary. The person begins defending the authority rather than examining the claim. What makes this especially dangerous is that expertise does not guarantee honesty, neutrality, or wisdom. It only guarantees familiarity. When respect becomes automatic, it bypasses the very intelligence meant to evaluate information. By the time manipulation becomes clear, the belief has already settled in deeply, protected not by evidence, but by the idea that someone qualified must know better. Underestimating repetition effects. Underestimating repetition effects is a vulnerability rooted in how intelligent people understand persuasion. They often believe influence works through strong arguments, evidence, or dramatic moments of insight. Repetition, by contrast, feels crude, too obvious to matter. If an idea is weak, hearing it again shouldn't make it stronger. That assumption feels logical, and that is exactly why it fails. The human brain does not treat familiarity as neutral. Repeated exposure quietly breeds comfort, and comfort is easily mistaken for truth. Ideas heard often begin to feel less threatening, less questionable, more reasonable, not because they have improved, but because they are no longer new. Intelligent people frequently overlook this because they notice their reasoning, not the subtle emotional shift that repetition creates beneath it. Manipulators understand that persuasion rarely happens in a single moment. They repeat phrases, frames, and narratives with small variations, allowing the idea to sink in without resistance. The intelligent mind engages each instance analytically, believing it has evaluated the idea already. What it misses is that each repetition lowers emotional friction, making acceptance feel natural rather than deliberate. Emotionally, repetition erodes vigilance. What once triggered skepticism begins to feel familiar, even boring. The mind relaxes, the nervous system stops reacting. Over time, the idea no longer feels like an external influence, but like something the person has always thought. That transition is almost impossible to detect from the inside. The most dangerous part is that intelligent people trust their ability to notice manipulation. They believe they would catch it if it were happening. But repetition does not announce itself as influence. It feels like background noise, and by the time the idea feels self-evident, the mind no longer remembers when it first entered, or how much resistance it once deserved. Belief in meritocracy. The belief in meritocracy is deeply appealing to intelligent people because it validates effort, discipline, and skill. It suggests that outcomes are earned, that systems reward competence, and that success is a reflection of ability rather than circumstance. This belief offers meaning and order, especially to those who have benefited from their intelligence. It feels fair, motivating, and morally clean. The vulnerability appears when this belief is applied to power and influence. Manipulation thrives in systems that claim to be merit-based because success is assumed to signal legitimacy. When someone rises, they are presumed deserving. Intelligent people trust positions, platforms, and visibility as evidence of value, often overlooking the invisible forces that shape who gets ahead. Emotionally, meritocracy reduces suspicion. If outcomes are earned, then exploitation feels unlikely. The idea that someone could gain influence through deception, networking, or manipulation rather than merit creates discomfort, so it is resisted. This allows manipulators to hide behind achievement, knowing their success will shield them from scrutiny. Meritocratic thinking also shifts blame inward. When something feels wrong, the intelligent person assumes they must be missing something or failing to understand the system. They look for personal error rather than structural distortion. This keeps them compliant and self-critical rather than skeptical. There is also identity at stake. If intelligence and effort are rewarded, then believing otherwise threatens one's own sense of worth. Questioning meritocracy can feel like questioning oneself. Manipulators exploit this by framing their authority as earned, making dissent feel like bitterness or incompetence. The danger is not in valuing effort, but in assuming fairness. When intelligence trusts the system too deeply, it stops guarding against those who game it. And once influence is mistaken for merit, manipulation no longer looks suspicious, it looks deserved. Ignoring emotional leverage. Ignoring emotional leverage happens when intelligent people believe influence operates only through ideas. They pay attention to arguments, evidence, and logic, while missing the emotional pressure quietly shaping the interaction. Praise, disappointment, urgency, guilt, and approval are treated as background noise rather than forces that actively steer behavior. Manipulators understand that emotional leverage is often more powerful than persuasion. They apply it subtly, rewarding agreement with warmth and punishing resistance with withdrawal or disapproval. The intelligent person notices the shift but explains it away as mood, misunderstanding, or social friction. Because no explicit demand is made, the leverage remains invisible. Emotionally, this creates conditioning. Certain responses feel safe and affirming, others feel tense or isolating. Over time, the person adjusts their behavior to restore emotional equilibrium, believing they are acting freely. Logic is used to justify the adjustment after the fact, masking the influence that caused it. Ignoring emotional leverage also prevents early resistance. Without recognizing the pressure, the intelligent person cannot name or confront it. They stay engaged, polite, and cooperative, even as their range of choices narrows. The interaction feels voluntary because no one ever says no. The most unsettling part is how clean it feels. There is no obvious manipulation, no argument to reject, no lie to expose. Influence works quietly, shaping decisions through emotional consequences rather than reasoning. By the time awareness arrives, patterns are already established. The intelligent person looks back and sees a trail of compromises they cannot fully explain, only realizing too late that leverage does not need force. It only needs to be felt and ignored. Overconfidence in detecting lies. Overconfidence in detecting lies forms when intelligence confuses awareness with accuracy. Intelligent people often believe that because they understand logic, psychology, or human behavior, they can spot dishonesty when it appears. They trust their ability to read inconsistencies, micro-expressions, or flawed arguments. This confidence feels earned, built from experience and insight. It is also precisely what allows deception to pass unnoticed. Most lies are not detected through clever observation. They are missed because they are emotionally congruent. A liar who believes in their own narrative or who delivers it calmly and confidently does not trigger the cues people expect. Intelligent individuals Convinced they would notice something off, stop questioning once nothing obvious appears. The absence of red flags becomes proof of honesty. Manipulators exploit this by avoiding overt deception. They tell partial truths, omit key details, or reframe reality without lying outright. Because the story feels consistent and emotionally smooth, the intelligent mind relaxes. It focuses on evaluating content rather than questioning intent. The belief, "I would catch it if something were wrong," becomes the blindfold. Emotionally, this overconfidence protects ego. Admitting that deception slipped through threatens identity, so when doubts arise later, they are rationalized away. The person assumes misunderstanding rather than manipulation, because believing otherwise would mean admitting their confidence was misplaced. The most dangerous lies are not those that collapse under scrutiny, but those that never invite it. Overconfidence removes the final layer of defense, humility. Without humility, intelligence stops verifying and starts assuming, and in that assumption, deception does not need to hide. It simply needs to feel normal enough to pass through unquestioned, protected by the belief that detection would have happened if it were necessary. Trust in internal consistency. Trust in internal consistency is a natural extension of an intelligent mind's love for structure and order. When beliefs, explanations, or systems align smoothly within themselves, they feel reliable. Contradictions are resolved, gaps are filled, and the whole framework appears solid. This internal harmony creates a sense of confidence that feels earned, as if coherence itself were evidence of truth. The danger is that consistency does not require accuracy. A system can be perfectly consistent and still be built on false premises. Intelligent people often overlook this because internal alignment reduces cognitive strain. When everything fits, the mind relaxes. It stops questioning the foundation and focuses on refining the structure, assuming that something so orderly must be sound. Manipulators exploit this by offering narratives that are self-reinforcing. Each idea supports the next, creating a closed loop where doubts are reinterpreted as misunderstandings rather than warnings. Once inside this loop, counter-evidence is dismissed not because it is weak, but because it disrupts the internal balance the mind has grown attached to. Emotionally, internal consistency feels like control. It provides relief from chaos and ambiguity, especially in complex or emotionally charged situations. Intelligent people, who often live with constant mental activity, are particularly drawn to frameworks that feel complete. Challenging them threatens not just beliefs, but emotional stability. Over time, this trust shifts from reality to the model itself. The person begins defending the system rather than testing it against experience. When inconsistencies with the real world appear, they are rationalized away to preserve the internal order. The most unsettling realization comes later. The mind was not protecting truth, but protecting coherence, and in doing so, allowed influence to reshape perception while everything still appeared to make perfect sense. Rationalizing sunk costs. Rationalizing sunk costs is one of the most powerful traps for intelligent people because it disguises itself as consistency and responsibility. After investing time, energy, reputation, or emotional effort into something, walking away feels irrational, even wasteful. The mind resists the idea that those investments might never pay off. Intelligence steps in to protect meaning, not truth. The deeper the investment, the stronger the rationalization. Intelligent people are especially skilled at this because they can generate sophisticated explanations for why continuing still makes sense. They reframe losses as learning, setbacks as necessary stages, and warning signs as temporary anomalies. The reasoning feels airtight, but it is driven by discomfort, not clarity. Manipulators exploit sunk costs by encouraging gradual investment. Small commitments accumulate until leaving feels too expensive. By the time doubts surface, the person is already entangled. Logic then works in reverse, defending the past instead of evaluating the present. The question quietly shifts from, "Is this good for me?" to, "How do I justify staying?" Emotionally, abandoning sunk costs feels like self-betrayal. It threatens identity, pride, and the story one tells about being rational and competent. Admitting a mistake feels worse than enduring harm, so endurance is reframed as resilience. There is also fear of embarrassment. Intelligent people often imagine how foolish they would look for having invested so much. This imagined judgment keeps them locked in place, even as evidence mounts. The most dangerous aspect is that sunk costs are invisible from the inside. They feel like commitment, loyalty, and discipline. But manipulation thrives when intelligence confuses perseverance with wisdom. At that point, logic is no longer a tool for decision-making. It becomes a shield protecting the very thing that is causing harm. Difficulty identifying social pressure. Difficulty identifying social pressure is common in intelligent people because pressure rarely feels like force. It feels like expectation, atmosphere, or unspoken rules, and those are easy to overlook when attention is focused on ideas rather than dynamics. Intelligent minds often assume that influence is explicit and verbal, not embedded in tone, timing, or group behavior. Social pressure works through implication. No one tells you what to do. You simply sense what is acceptable, what will be rewarded, and what will create friction. Intelligent people often misread this as personal preference or coincidence, believing they are acting independently. Manipulators and dominant personalities rely on this blindness, shaping environments where certain responses feel easier and others feel costly. Emotionally, this pressure creates quiet compliance. The person adapts to avoid discomfort, not realizing the discomfort is engineered. They stay silent, agree partially, or delay objections, telling themselves it is about diplomacy or patience. Each small concession feels harmless, but together they form a pattern of influence. Difficulty identifying social pressure also prevents resistance. You cannot push back against something you cannot see. The intelligent person waits for a clear request or demand that never comes. Meanwhile, behavior is being shaped through subtle cues like exclusion, approval, or status shifts. The most dangerous aspect is how normal it feels. Social pressure blends into the background of interaction. By the time the intelligent person notices they are acting differently, they often cannot trace why. They feel constrained without knowing who constrained them. Influence has already done its work, not through argument or authority, but through the quiet weight of expectation that was never named. Belief that truth naturally prevails. The belief that truth naturally prevails is rooted in a deep faith in reason, evidence, and long-term fairness. Intelligent people often assume that while lies may succeed temporarily, reality will eventually assert itself. Facts will surface. Logic will win. This belief feels comforting and morally grounding. It suggests that vigilance is less urgent because truth has momentum on its side. This assumption creates passivity. When someone believes truth will emerge on its own, they feel less pressure to challenge falsehoods aggressively or early. Doubt is postponed. Intervention is delayed. The intelligent mind watches, analyzes, and waits, confident that exposure is inevitable. Manipulators thrive in this waiting period because influence does not need permanence to cause damage. It only needs time. Truth does not compete on equal footing. It does not spread automatically, nor does it defend itself. It requires attention, repetition, and protection. But when intelligent people assume truth is self-correcting, they underestimate the power of narrative, emotion, and control over information flow. Lies gain traction not because they are stronger, but because they are louder, simpler, or better timed. Emotionally, this belief preserves self-image. Acting forcefully against falsehood can feel uncomfortable, confrontational, or excessive. Waiting feels rational and restrained. The person believes they are taking the high road, unaware that delay itself is a form of consent. The most dangerous aspect of this belief is that by the time truth does surface, the consequences are already locked in. Decisions have been made, trust has been placed, power has shifted. The intelligent person looks back and realizes that truth did not fail to prevail. It was never given the conditions to matter, and manipulation succeeded not by defeating truth, but by outpacing it. Underestimating narrative framing. Underestimating narrative framing is a blind spot that emerges from believing facts speak for themselves. Intelligent people tend to focus on data, logic, and accuracy, assuming that if information is correct, its impact will be neutral and its interpretation stable. Framing feels cosmetic, like presentation rather than influence. This belief allows stories to do their work unnoticed. The human mind does not absorb facts in isolation. It absorbs meaning through structure, sequence, and emphasis. Narrative framing decides what comes first, what is highlighted, what is omitted, and what emotional lens is applied. Two identical sets of facts can produce entirely different conclusions depending on how they are arranged. Intelligent people often miss this because they engage with content, not the container holding it. Manipulators understand that framing determines interpretation before reasoning even begins. By positioning events as progress or decline, threat or opportunity, heroism or failure, they guide emotional responses that logic later justifies. The intelligent mind believes it is evaluating information objectively, unaware that the emotional direction has already been set. Emotionally, narratives reduce complexity. They turn overwhelming information into something digestible and meaningful. This relief feels like understanding. Once a narrative clicks, it becomes the lens through which new information is filtered. Contradictory facts feel confusing or irrelevant, not because they lack value, but because they do not fit the story already accepted. The danger lies in invisibility. Framing does not feel like persuasion, it feels like context. Intelligent people trust themselves to notice bias in arguments, but narratives bypass argument entirely. They shape perception before analysis begins. And once the story feels right, the mind stops asking who built it, why it was shaped that way, and whose interests it quietly serves while appearing simply to explain reality. Desire to be seen as open-minded. The desire to be seen as open-minded is a powerful social and emotional driver, especially for intelligent people. Openness signals sophistication, humility, and intellectual maturity. It suggests a willingness to consider new ideas and resist dogma. Over time, this trait becomes part of identity, something to be displayed and protected rather than simply practiced. The vulnerability appears when openness turns performative. Instead of evaluating ideas privately and honestly, the person begins managing how their receptiveness is perceived. Rejecting an idea too quickly risks looking rigid, biased, or unintelligent. Manipulation exploits this hesitation by framing harmful or self-serving narratives as merely alternative perspectives that deserve consideration. Emotionally, being open-minded is tied to belonging. Intelligent people often exist in circles where tolerance and nuance are moral currencies. Questioning certain ideas can lead to social friction or quiet exclusion. To avoid this, doubts are softened, boundaries delayed, and criticism postponed. Influence grows in the space between internal discomfort and external politeness. Manipulators lean into this by presenting themselves as misunderstood thinkers or by accusing skeptics of closed-mindedness. This reframes resistance as a character flaw rather than discernment. The intelligent person then redirects energy toward proving openness instead of protecting judgment. There is also an internal conflict at play. True open-mindedness requires the ability to reject ideas after examination. But when identity is attached to openness, rejection feels like failure. The person stays engaged longer than necessary, giving influence more time to work. The danger is subtle. The desire to appear open-minded can override the ability to be decisive. Intelligence becomes preoccupied with signaling virtue rather than seeking truth. And while the person waits to be fair, reasonable, and receptive, manipulation quietly settles in, welcomed not because it is convincing, but because rejecting it would look worse than accepting it. Intellectual pride. Intellectual pride forms when intelligence becomes more than a skill and turns into identity. It is not loud arrogance, but a quiet confidence in one's ability to understand, analyze, and see through things. This pride is often reinforced by recognition, success, and being right more often than not. Over time, it creates a subtle belief that one's mind is a reliable filter against error and deception. This pride lowers defenses. When someone presents an idea that feels sophisticated or challenging, the intelligent person engages eagerly, assuming they are equipped to handle it. Doubt feels unnecessary. Questioning motives feels excessive. Manipulators exploit this by framing influence as intellectual respect, offering complexity, nuance, or insider knowledge that flatters the mind. Emotionally, intellectual pride resists correction. Admitting influence feels like admitting inferiority, so discomfort is reframed as misunderstanding rather than warning. The person defends their interpretation because letting it go would mean letting go of the self-image attached to it. Intellectual pride also creates distance from instinct. Feelings are seen as less reliable than thought, even when they signal danger. The mind trusts its reasoning over its reactions, believing sophistication equals safety. The most dangerous part is how dignified this pride feels. It aligns with competence, independence, and self-mastery, yet it quietly invites manipulation by signaling predictability. Once a manipulator understands what kind of intelligence you value, they can speak its language. Influence does not need to overpower the mind, it only needs to appeal to it, and intellectual pride ensures the door is already open. Assuming manipulation requires malice. Assuming manipulation requires malice is a belief that makes influence feel easier to spot than it actually is. Intelligent people often imagine manipulation as intentional harm, deliberate deception, or conscious exploitation. They look for cruelty, dishonesty, or clear bad actors. When those signs are absent, defenses lower. If someone seems well-meaning, polite, or emotionally sincere, manipulation is ruled out too early. This assumption ignores how often manipulation happens without conscious intent. People influence others to protect themselves, preserve status, avoid discomfort, or fulfill unmet needs. None of this requires malice. In fact, some of the most manipulative behavior comes from people who genuinely believe they are justified, helpful, or even moral in what they are doing. Manipulators benefit from this blind spot by presenting themselves as reasonable and emotionally transparent. They frame their actions as misunderstandings, necessities, or compromises. The intelligent mind accepts this framing because it aligns with a belief in good faith. Questioning intent begins to feel unfair or accusatory, especially when the other person appears sincere. Emotionally, this creates a trap. The intelligent person empathizes, explains, and accommodates, believing that clarity will resolve the issue. They do not recognize that influence can exist without hostility and coercion can occur without cruelty. By the time harm becomes clear, it feels confusing rather than intentional. The most dangerous manipulations are not driven by evil intent, but by unchecked self-interest wrapped in rational explanation. When malice is treated as a prerequisite for manipulation, influence gains a safe disguise. It passes as normal interaction, reasonable compromise, or human flaw, quietly reshaping behavior while the intelligent mind waits for a villain that never appears, confusing intelligence with wisdom. Confusing intelligence with wisdom is a mistake that grows out of long-term success in thinking. Intelligence rewards speed, pattern recognition, and analytical strength. When these abilities consistently produce good outcomes, it becomes tempting to assume they apply universally. Over time, the mind begins to treat cleverness as insight and insight as judgment without noticing the missing layer. Wisdom is not about processing information faster or understanding systems more deeply. It is about recognizing limits, reading context, and knowing when not to engage. Intelligent people often overlook this distinction because their intelligence has worked for them before. It feels reliable, it feels earned, and questioning it feels unnecessary, even self-defeating. Manipulation exploits this confusion by appealing directly to intelligence while bypassing wisdom. Clever arguments, intricate reasoning, and sophisticated language draw the mind in. The intelligent person engages fully, believing that understanding something deeply is the same as handling it safely. Meanwhile, wisdom would have noticed the misaligned incentives, emotional undercurrents, or long-term consequences that logic alone does not flag. Emotionally, this confusion feeds identity. Being intelligent becomes a source of pride and security. Accepting that intelligence does not guarantee good judgment feels destabilizing. It introduces the uncomfortable idea that one can think brilliantly and still choose poorly. To avoid that discomfort, the mind keeps trusting its analytical ability even when the situation demands restraint rather than reasoning. The cost accumulates quietly. Time is spent solving problems that should have been avoided. Energy is invested in people who should not have been trusted. Influence takes hold not because the person lacked intelligence, but because intelligence was asked to do a job it was never meant to do. Wisdom would have said, "Stop." Intelligence said, "Think harder," and that difference made all the impact. Overestimating self-awareness. Overestimating self-awareness is a quiet but powerful vulnerability, especially in intelligent people who spend a great deal of time reflecting, analyzing, and understanding themselves. Self-knowledge feels like mastery. When someone can name their emotions, articulate their motives, and recognize their patterns, it creates the belief that nothing important is happening beneath the surface without their consent. The danger lies in confusing insight with control. Awareness does not stop influence. It only makes it easier to explain. Intelligent people often notice their reactions, but assume that noticing them neutralizes their effect. They believe that because they can observe a feeling, it no longer has power. In reality, emotions can guide behavior even while being accurately described. Manipulation exploits this by operating at speeds and depths awareness cannot fully track. Subtle shifts in tone, timing, and framing shape perception before conscious reflection catches up. The person feels informed, not influenced. They narrate their internal state confidently while moving in a direction they did not consciously choose. Emotionally, overestimating self-awareness creates false safety. It discourages external checks. Feedback from others feels unnecessary or intrusive because the person believes they already see themselves clearly. This isolation makes blind spots larger, not smaller. There is also pride involved. Self-aware becomes part of identity, something that distinguishes them from others. Admitting blind spots threatens that image, so discomfort is rationalized rather than investigated. The person assumes they understand why they feel pulled, attached, or persuaded, and that assumption replaces curiosity. The most dangerous part is that self-awareness often grows after influence has already taken effect. It explains the outcome, not the cause. When intelligence mistakes reflection for immunity, it underestimates how deeply and quietly behavior can be guided. The person believes they are steering, while unaware that the direction was chosen for them long before they felt the wheel in their hands. Belief that education prevents bias. The belief that education prevents bias is one of the most comforting myths intelligent people carry. Knowledge feels like purification. Learning about psychology, logic, statistics, and history creates the sense that blind spots have been exposed and neutralized. Bias becomes something that happens to the uninformed, not to those who have studied how the mind works. This belief quietly lowers vigilance. The educated mind assumes awareness cancels distortion, not realizing that bias adapts. It does not disappear when named. It becomes more subtle, more rationalized, and more convincing. Intelligent people often recognize bias in others with ease while remaining blind to how it operates within their own reasoning. Manipulators rely on this confidence. They frame influence in educated language, using data, theory, and credible references to bypass suspicion. The intelligent person engages intellectually, believing that shared knowledge creates shared objectivity. Meanwhile, emotional framing, selective evidence, and value alignment quietly steer interpretation. Emotionally, this belief protects self-image. Admitting bias feels like regression, as if learning has failed. When confronted with evidence of influence, the intelligent mind often defends itself by refining arguments rather than questioning assumptions. Bias is intellectualized instead of examined. The most dangerous part is that education can make bias more persuasive. A trained mind builds stronger justifications, not fewer distortions. Confidence in neutrality becomes the blind spot itself. The person believes they are evaluating ideas on merit alone, unaware that their education has shaped which ideas feel reasonable, which voices feel credible, and which conclusions feel inevitable long before conscious judgment ever begins. Excessive tolerance for manipulation tactics. Excessive tolerance for manipulation tactics develops when intelligence confuses understanding with acceptance. Intelligent people often recognize subtle pressure, framing, or emotional leverage, but instead of responding with boundaries, they respond with analysis. They tell themselves that noticing the tactic is enough, that awareness neutralizes its effect. This belief quietly erodes resistance. Because intelligent people can explain what is happening, they tolerate it longer than they should. They observe manipulation as an interesting phenomenon rather than a signal to disengage. The behavior becomes something to interpret, not something to stop. Meanwhile, the tactic continues working, not because it is invisible, but because it is permitted. Emotionally, tolerance feels like maturity. Reacting strongly feels unsophisticated. Setting boundaries feels abrupt. The intelligent mind prides itself on composure and nuance, even when composure is costing safety. Manipulators exploit this by applying pressure gradually, staying just below the threshold that would justify confrontation. Each instance feels minor on its own, and tolerance accumulates quietly. Another danger lies in intellectual empathy. Intelligent people can imagine why someone might use manipulative tactics: fear, insecurity, social conditioning. This understanding softens response. Harm is contextualized, excused, or reframed as unintentional. The focus shifts from impact to explanation. What makes this especially dangerous is that manipulation does not require ignorance to work. It requires exposure. Tactics influence through repetition and emotional wear, not surprise. By tolerating what should be resisted, the intelligent person slowly adapts to the pressure. Over time, what once felt unacceptable becomes normal, not because it was harmless, but because intelligence turned recognition into patience, and patience into quiet compliance. Assuming persuasion equals reason. Assuming persuasion equals reason is a vulnerability that forms when intelligence becomes the primary lens for understanding influence. Intelligent people often believe that minds are changed through better arguments, clearer explanations, and stronger evidence. Persuasion, in this view, is simply reason doing its job. If someone is convincing, it must be because they are correct or at least logically sound. This assumption ignores how persuasion actually works on the human nervous system. Most influence does not enter through logic. It enters through emotion, identity, timing, and social pressure, then recruits reason afterward to justify the shift. Intelligent people often notice the justification but miss the trigger. They believe they were persuaded by ideas, not by how those ideas made them feel. Manipulators exploit this by wrapping emotional leverage in rational language. They present arguments that sound reasonable while subtly activating fear, belonging, pride, or moral superiority. Because the surface is logical, the intelligent mind relaxes. It engages respectfully, unaware that the real work is happening beneath conscious awareness. Emotionally, this belief flatters intelligence. It reinforces the idea that the mind is sovereign, that thought governs behavior. Admitting that persuasion bypasses reason feels threatening. It suggests that being convinced does not always mean being correct, and that clarity can be engineered without truth. As a result, intelligent people often argue harder instead of stepping back. They believe flawed persuasion can be defeated with better reasoning, not realizing that reason was never the primary battlefield. By the time they sense something is wrong, the influence has already shaped their emotional posture, making resistance feel irrational or extreme. The most dangerous part is that persuasion that feels reasonable rarely feels manipulative. It feels like understanding. It feels like insight. And because the intelligent mind trusts reason so deeply, it may never question whether logic was leading the way or merely following where influence had already quietly decided to go. Failure to recognize emotional hooks. Failure to recognize emotional hooks is a vulnerability that hides behind confidence and rational thought. Intelligent people often believe they are moved by ideas, principles, and evidence, not by feelings. When something captures their attention or commitment, they assume it did so because it made sense. What they miss is that attention is rarely captured by logic first. It is captured by emotion. Emotional hooks work quietly. They take the form of feeling seen, feeling challenged, feeling morally aligned, or feeling special. They trigger curiosity, pride, fear, hope, or belonging before the mind has time to evaluate what is happening. The intelligent person experiences this pull as interest or insight, not as influence. By the time reasoning begins, the hook is already set. Manipulators rely on this blindness. They introduce subtle emotional rewards, validation disguised as respect, urgency disguised as importance, exclusivity disguised as depth. The content feels intellectual, but the grip is emotional. Logic then becomes a tool to stay connected to the feeling rather than to question it. Because intelligent people are often uncomfortable admitting emotional leverage, they reinterpret attachment as alignment and excitement as clarity. Discomfort is framed as growth. Doubt is reframed as complexity. The hook tightens while remaining invisible. There is also an identity threat involved. Recognizing an emotional hook requires admitting vulnerability, and that feels incompatible with the self-image of being thoughtful and self-directed. So the possibility is dismissed before it is examined. The most dangerous part is that emotional hooks feel good. They energize, motivate, and engage. They make the person feel alive and mentally stimulated. This positive feedback masks the loss of autonomy. The person believes they are choosing freely, unaware that their attention, loyalty, and reasoning are being quietly guided by feelings they never thought to question. Attraction to contrarian positions. Attraction to contrarian positions is common in intelligent people because it feels like independence of thought. Questioning consensus, challenging norms, and seeing what others overlook creates a powerful sense of intellectual autonomy. Being contrarian feels courageous, insightful, and resistant to herd mentality. It reinforces the identity of someone who thinks for themselves. Manipulators exploit this by presenting influence as rebellion rather than control. They frame ideas as suppressed truths, unpopular insights, or perspectives only the sharp-minded are willing to consider. The intelligent person leans in, not wanting to be aligned with the uncritical majority. Skepticism is redirected away from the message and toward the crowd being challenged. Emotionally, contrarianism satisfies the desire to feel distinct and perceptive. It turns agreement into conformity and disagreement into proof of insight. This emotional reward can override caution, making the person more receptive to extreme or misleading claims simply because they oppose mainstream narratives. Attraction to contrarian positions also dulls corrective feedback. Criticism is dismissed as conventional thinking. Warnings are interpreted as resistance from those who don't get it. This isolates the person from reality checks while strengthening attachment to the position. The most dangerous aspect is that contrarianism can be engineered. Manipulation does not require truth, only opposition. Once the intelligent person commits, their reasoning works to defend the stance, not evaluate it. What began as independent thought becomes a predictable pattern. The desire to stand apart quietly becomes a lever, and influence slips in wearing the mask of rebellion, while the mind congratulates itself for not following the crowd. Discounting simplicity as naivete. Discounting simplicity as naivete is a habit that forms when intelligence becomes closely associated with complexity. Intelligent people learn to value layered explanations, subtle distinctions, and sophisticated reasoning. Over time, anything simple begins to feel suspicious, incomplete, or intellectually shallow. If an answer does not feel complex enough, it is assumed to be wrong. This creates a blind spot where obvious truths are ignored because they lack elegance. Simple explanations are dismissed as things less intelligent people would believe. The mind searches for hidden variables, deeper motives, or unseen forces even when none are necessary. In doing so, it overlooks what is directly observable. Manipulators exploit this by adding complexity where none is needed. They introduce nuance, jargon, and intellectual framing to make straightforward situations feel debatable. Meanwhile, simple warnings or clear interpretations are brushed aside as unsophisticated. The intelligent person trusts the complicated explanation because it feels more deserving of respect. Emotionally, complexity flatters identity. It reinforces the sense of being insightful and discerning. Accepting a simple truth can feel like diminishing one's own intelligence, as if recognizing the obvious is a step backward. So the mind resists, not because the idea is wrong, but because it feels too easy. The danger is that reality is often simple even when it is uncomfortable. Someone is lying. Someone is using you. Someone does not have your best interests in mind. These truths do not require elaborate theories, only honesty. But when simplicity is mistaken for naivete, clarity is postponed. And in that delay, manipulation gains time, protected by the assumption that anything real must be more complicated than it actually is. Overvaluing internal logic. Overvaluing internal logic is a subtle trap that forms when intelligence begins to trust coherence more than contact with reality. Intelligent people are skilled at building mental models that are consistent, elegant, and internally sound. When every piece fits together cleanly, the mind experiences a sense of control and satisfaction. The system feels true because it makes sense. The problem is that a system can be internally logical and still be wrong. Internal logic only guarantees consistency within the model, not accuracy in the world. Manipulation exploits this by shaping the initial assumptions. Once those are accepted, everything that follows appears reasonable. The intelligent mind becomes absorbed in refining the structure instead of questioning whether the structure should exist at all. Emotionally, internal logic feels safe. It creates a private space where uncertainty is reduced and contradictions can be resolved intellectually rather than confronted experientially. When reality conflicts with the model, reality is often treated as noise. The person trusts their reasoning over their perception, assuming the issue lies in misunderstanding rather than distortion. Manipulators benefit from this because they do not need to control outcomes, only inputs. By controlling which facts, frames, or premises enter the system, they allow the person's own intelligence to do the rest. The individual believes they are thinking independently, unaware that the path was quietly laid in advance. There is also pride involved. Internal logic becomes a marker of intelligence, something to defend. Admitting the model is flawed feels like admitting intellectual failure, so the person doubles down, explaining away inconsistencies instead of revisiting foundations. The danger is not in reasoning deeply, but in reasoning in isolation. When intelligence overvalues internal logic, it disconnects from feedback, emotion, and lived experience. At that point, manipulation no longer feels like influence from the outside. It feels like insight arising from within, and that makes it far harder to question or escape. Ignoring incentives. Ignoring incentives is one of the most reliable ways intelligent people misunderstand human behavior. When someone is trained to value logic, principles, and articulated beliefs, they naturally focus on what is being said rather than what is being gained. Arguments are examined for coherence and depth, while underlying rewards remain unseen. This creates a gap where manipulation can operate without resistance. Incentives quietly shape behavior long before reasoning appears. People may speak in the language of truth, ethics, or efficiency, but their actions follow power, status, money, security, or admiration. Manipulation does not need to lie when incentives do the work. The intelligent mind debates ideas, unaware that the outcome was decided by what someone stands to gain. Emotionally, questioning incentives feels uncomfortable. It can feel suspicious, even unfair, to assume self-interest when someone appears thoughtful or principled. Intelligent people often resist this perspective because it feels reductive, as if it ignores the complexity of human motivation. Manipulators depend on this resistance. They cloak incentives in noble narratives, knowing few will look behind them. Ignoring incentives also creates misplaced trust in authority and expertise. Passion is mistaken for sincerity. Confidence is mistaken for alignment. The person assumes that strong reasoning signals honest intent, not realizing that intelligence and self-interest frequently coexist. There is also relief in not looking. Tracking incentives requires emotional distance and vigilance, which can be draining. It is easier to stay in the abstract world of ideas than to confront the uncomfortable reality of human advantage seeking. The most dangerous part is that incentives do not disappear when ignored. They become more powerful. When intelligence analyzes arguments without asking who benefits, it surrenders its strongest predictive tool. And in that absence, manipulation does not argue. It simply moves, guided by reward, confident that no one is watching the direction it follows. Belief that being right is enough. The belief that being right is enough is rooted in a deep faith in truth and logic. Intelligent people often assume that correct reasoning naturally leads to good outcomes, fair treatment, and personal safety. If the facts are solid and the argument is sound, they believe nothing else should matter. This belief feels principled, even noble, but it ignores how power, emotion, and intent operate in the real world. Being right does not protect you from being influenced. Manipulators do not need you to be wrong. They only need you to be engaged. An intelligent person can hold a correct position and still be maneuvered emotionally, socially, or strategically. While the mind focuses on accuracy, influence works through timing, framing, and leverage that exist outside the argument itself. Emotionally, this belief creates complacency. The intelligent person feels safe standing on correctness, assuming it will carry weight on its own. They underestimate how often truth is ignored, reinterpreted, or weaponized. This leaves them vulnerable to those who are less concerned with accuracy and more concerned with outcome. Belief in correctness also delays self-protection. Walking away feels unnecessary if you know you are right. Setting boundaries feels excessive if the logic is sound. Manipulators exploit this by keeping discussions alive, knowing that extended engagement benefits them, not the truth. The most dangerous part is that being right feels complete. It creates closure without safety. The person assumes the work is done once the conclusion is reached, unaware that influence continues after correctness is established. Truth may exist, but without awareness of power and emotion, it does not defend itself, and it does not defend you. Underestimating social conformity. Underestimating social conformity comes from believing that intelligence equals independence of thought. Intelligent people often see themselves as resistant to group pressure, guided by evidence rather than popularity. They assume conformity is something that happens to others, those less informed, less confident, or less reflective. This belief creates a powerful blind spot. Social conformity rarely feels like pressure. It feels like alignment. It shows up as shared language, common assumptions, and unspoken rules about what is acceptable to question. Intelligent people often enter these environments believing they are evaluating ideas freely, unaware that the range of reasonable thought has already been quietly narrowed. Manipulation exploits this by shaping norms rather than arguments. When certain views are treated as obvious, sophisticated, or morally correct, disagreement begins to feel unnecessary or socially costly. The intelligent person senses the risk of standing apart, not through fear, but through subtle signals of exclusion, disapproval, or lowered status. The pressure is emotional, not logical. Emotionally, humans are wired to belong. Intelligence does not remove this wiring. It often rationalizes it. The mind constructs explanations for why the group consensus makes sense, mistaking comfort for correctness. Dissent is delayed until certainty feels overwhelming, and by then, silence has already reinforced the norm. The most dangerous part of conformity is that it does not require obedience. It only requires adaptation. Language shifts, emphases change, questions soften. The person believes they are still thinking independently, unaware that their thoughts are being shaped by what feels acceptable to say, think, and believe in that environment. Manipulation succeeds not by forcing agreement, but by making disagreement feel unnecessary, awkward, or strangely irrational. Difficulty recognizing coercion without force. Difficulty recognizing coercion without force is a blind spot that emerges when intelligence equates harm with obvious pressure. Intelligent people often imagine coercion as something overt: threats, commands, or physical restraint. If no one is yelling, demanding, or forcing, the situation feels voluntary. Choice appears intact, and that assumption creates false safety. Modern coercion rarely looks aggressive. It operates through subtle constraints, emotional leverage, and manufactured necessity. Time pressure, social expectations, guilt, fear of loss, or withdrawal of approval quietly narrow options until only one feels viable. The intelligent person still experiences this as choice because no rule has been broken and no line has been crossed visibly. Manipulators rely on this blindness. They never say, "You must." They say, "It would be disappointing if you didn't," or "This is your chance," or "Most people would understand." The pressure is emotional and contextual, not explicit. Because there is no force, the intelligent mind fails to label it as coercion. Emotionally, recognizing coercion without force is uncomfortable because it challenges the belief in autonomy. Intelligent people value agency and rational choice. Admitting that one's decisions were constrained by social or emotional pressure feels destabilizing, so the possibility is dismissed. There is also a moral confusion involved. Subtle coercion often arrives wrapped in politeness, care, or shared values. Calling it out feels ungrateful or paranoid. The person assumes that as long as consent exists, coercion does not. The danger is that freedom can be eroded without being removed. When intelligence looks only for force, it misses pressure, and when pressure goes unnamed, it goes unresisted. The person believes they chose freely, unaware that the environment was shaped to make every other choice feel unsafe, unreasonable, or impossible. Rationalizing contradictory behavior. Rationalizing contradictory behavior is a subtle habit that feels like intelligence at work. When someone acts inconsistently, intelligent people instinctively look for explanations rather than conclusions. They assume there must be context they are missing, pressures they do not see, or complexity beneath the surface. This instinct to reconcile contradictions feels fair, thoughtful, and emotionally mature. The danger emerges when explanation replaces evaluation. Contradictions are not always signals of depth. They are often signals of misalignment or deception. Manipulation thrives when inconsistent actions are repeatedly forgiven through logic. Each rationalization smooths over a warning sign, allowing harmful patterns to continue without consequence. Emotionally, contradiction creates discomfort. It threatens the mind's desire for coherence. Instead of questioning the person or the situation, the intelligent mind questions itself. It generates narratives that preserve trust. They didn't mean it, circumstances changed, intentions matter more than outcomes. Over time, these stories become protective shields against acknowledging reality. Manipulators rely on this tendency. They behave inconsistently while offering just enough explanation to invite interpretation. The intelligent person engages, trying to resolve the inconsistency intellectually, unaware that the inconsistency itself is the strategy. Confusion delays clarity, and delay increases control. There is also an identity element. Seeing through contradiction requires decisive judgment, which can feel unsophisticated or harsh. Intelligent people often prefer understanding over confrontation, but understanding without boundaries becomes permission. The most dangerous aspect is that repeated rationalization trains self-doubt. The person learns to distrust their own observations and rely instead on constructed explanations. Over time, reality becomes negotiable. When intelligence works harder to make sense of contradictions than to respond to them, it stops being a tool for discernment and becomes a mechanism for self-deception, quietly protecting behavior that should never have been defended. Trust in intellectual peers. Trust in intellectual peers forms because shared intelligence feels like shared values. When someone speaks your language, references familiar ideas, and demonstrates competence, it creates an immediate sense of alignment. Intelligent people often assume that those who think similarly are also operating with similar ethics, intentions, and respect for truth. This assumption feels efficient and reassuring. Manipulators exploit this by positioning themselves as equals. They mirror reasoning styles, adopt familiar frameworks, and signal membership in the same intellectual tribe. Once this bond forms, scrutiny drops. Red flags are reframed as complexity. Questioning motives feels unnecessary when competence has already been established. Emotionally, peer trust lowers defenses faster than authority ever could. Disagreement becomes collaborative rather than adversarial. Influence is received as insight rather than pressure. The intelligent person opens themselves intellectually and emotionally, believing they are among people who get it. This trust also discourages challenge. Calling out problematic behavior feels like betrayal or elitism. The person hesitates, not wanting to disrupt group harmony or undermine mutual respect. Manipulators rely on this silence. They operate within the protection of shared identity, knowing criticism will be softened or delayed. The most dangerous part is how invisible this trust is. It feels natural, earned, and rational. Yet intelligence does not guarantee honesty or goodwill. By the time the intelligent person realizes the peer relationship has been used as leverage, influence has already taken root. The bond that created openness becomes the channel through which manipulation flows, quietly and efficiently, under the cover of mutual respect. Desire to solve instead of avoid. The desire to solve instead of avoid is deeply ingrained in intelligent people. From an early age, they are rewarded for fixing problems, untangling confusion, and persisting where others give up. Difficulty becomes a signal that effort is required, not that retreat is wise. When something feels wrong, the instinct is not to leave, but to engage harder and figure it out. Manipulators exploit this reflex by presenting situations as solvable rather than unsafe. Conflict is framed as misunderstanding. Pressure is framed as a challenge. Harmful dynamics are reframed as puzzles waiting for the right insight. The intelligent person stays because leaving feels premature, irresponsible, or intellectually weak. Emotionally, solving feels empowering. Avoiding feels passive. Walking away without resolution can feel like abandoning potential or failing to live up to one's capacity. The mind convinces itself that clarity is just one more conversation away, one more explanation, one more attempt at fixing things. This creates a dangerous delay. While the person is trying to solve, damage continues. Boundaries erode under the weight of continued engagement. The focus shifts from self-protection to problem management. Manipulation does not need to trap someone permanently. It only needs to keep them trying. What makes this especially dangerous is that not all situations are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be exited. Intelligence excels at repair, but it struggles with recognition of irreversibility. By the time the intelligent person realizes the problem is not solvable, they are already invested, emotionally and psychologically. Avoidance would have protected them early. Solving kept them present, and presence was all manipulation needed to take hold.